Money is usually introduced as a thing, a coin, a note, a number on a page. Weimar Germany taught a different lesson. Money could remain present everywhere, stacked, stamped, counted, carried, and yet stop working as money. It could become abundant and useless at the same time. That is the quiet horror of hyperinflation, not that money disappears, but that it loses the power to measure, to store, and to promise. Picture Berlin on a gray morning when the air smells of coal and wet stone. A modest clerk leaves his apartment with a leather satchel that once carried files. Today, it carries banknotes. He is not wealthy. He is simply preparing for ordinary errands. In shop windows, prices are written in chalk because ink would be outdated before the day ends. At a bakery, he joins a line that moves with the stiffness of resignation. When his turn arrives, the baker names a price that sounds absurdly high, then shrugs as if the number belongs to the weather. The clerk counts notes quickly, not to display prosperity, but to prevent delay. Delay means the price may change again. He once tracked expenses in pfennigs. Now he tracks minutes. The true currency is time, and time is running faster than his calm can follow. This is not a story of bad arithmetic. It is a story about trust and coordination. Money is a social technology for keeping promises across distance and across days. It is a unit of account, so we can compare unlike things. It is a medium of exchange, so we can trade without the slow search for barter partners. It is a store of value, so labor done today can be carried into tomorrow. Hyperinflation attacks all three at once. It breaks the unit of account by making prices unstable. It weakens the medium of exchange by making sellers hesitant to accept payment that will shrink before they can replace stock. It destroys the store of value by turning saving into a losing trade. At first, inflation can feel like weather. People complain, adjust, continue. Wages rise, prices rise, and the world remains recognizable. Then, inflation becomes a habit. Employers schedule wage talks more often, merchants reprice more often, the state issues more notes, the public learns to spend quickly. Once that pattern settles, time itself changes. The interval between earning and spending shrinks. The interval between pricing and repricing shrinks. The interval between trust and suspicion shrinks. A society that once planned in seasons begins to plan in days and then in hours. Consider a widow in a quiet district who keeps her savings in a tin box. She has done what respectable people were taught to do: set aside a portion, avoid debt, rely on prudence. Each month, she visits the post office to collect a pension. At first, it pays for rent and coal. Later, it pays for rent only. Later, it pays for coal only. Later, it pays for neither. The tin box becomes a small museum of a former life, full of official paper that now feels like dried leaves. She does not feel cheated by a single person. She feels betrayed by the rules themselves, because the rule she trusted has been rewritten without her consent. Across town, a student sells books that he once read for pleasure. A factory worker accepts wages twice a day and runs to the shops during the lunch break because by evening the same wages will buy less. A shopkeeper begins to prefer foreign coins, cigarettes, soap, anything that holds value longer than paper. A farmer outside the city does not want cash. He wants tools, seed, wire. The economy becomes a negotiation over what still means something and what has become only a symbol. The essential point is simple, and we will return to it again and again. Money is not paper. Money is shared belief made measurable. Paper is a token of that belief. When belief thins, tokens can multiply without restoring what was lost. Hyperinflation is what happens when the token keeps arriving while the belief drains away. How does a society arrive there? Not by waking up one morning and choosing ruin. It arrives through pressures that seem temporary, decisions that seem reversible, debts that seem manageable, and arguments that postpone hard choices. It arrives when a state must pay, cannot tax enough, cannot borrow on acceptable terms, and reaches for an instrument that feels immediate: central bank credit, new issues, and the conversion of future capacity into present claims. Yet the Weimar story is not only "they printed too much." That sentence is comfortable because it is clean. The reality is more instructive. The war came first, the financing of the war came next, defeat in the struggle over who would bear the cost came after that. Reparations entered the picture, and with them a continuing dispute about capacity and legitimacy. Political instability intensified every dilemma. As the currency weakened, the temptation to use it anyway became stronger, because each new issue briefly postponed the reckoning and made the next issue easier to justify. We will move slowly through this chain because the chain matters. If you understand the sequence, you understand why hyperinflation is not merely monetary. It is a collapse of institutional coordination. It is the moment when contracts stop binding, when accounting becomes fiction, and when people retreat into shorter horizons. It is also the moment when stability can only be restored by rebuilding belief, not merely by issuing a new design of paper. On the tram home, the clerk hears passengers trade tips as if they were rules. Buy bread first, pay rent early, keep a bar of soap. No one calls it economics, they call it sense. A currency's collapse is learned, one day at a time. For now, hold one image. A satchel full of notes, heavy in the hand and light in meaning. Abundance is not security. Numbers are not value. When money becomes paper, society must relearn how to measure the world. To understand Weimar's hyperinflation, we begin before the Republic existed, when the German Empire believed it could finance a great war without paying for it immediately. In 1914, Germany entered the conflict with a modern industrial economy and an advanced banking system. It also entered with a political choice, to rely heavily on borrowing supported by the central bank rather than on immediate taxation. The promise behind that choice was simple and tempting. Victory would bring security and advantage, and the future would repay what the present could not bear. In those first months, the arrangement quietly felt orderly. Banks opened subscription books, newspapers printed lists of contributors, and officials spoke of finance as a front. Families treated the bonds as dowry and inheritance, an asset to pass on. Few asked how the interest would be paid if the war lasted years, and fewer imagined that repayment might arrive in a currency that no longer held still. A schoolteacher in a provincial town reads a pamphlet urging citizens to subscribe to the war loan. The language is solemn, it is patriotic to lend, it is prudent to invest, it is almost moral to transform savings into support for the nation. The teacher goes to the local bank, signs his name with careful handwriting, and receives a certificate printed on fine paper. It feels like solidity. It feels like participation. He thinks of it as money placed somewhere safe, like a stone set into a wall. The clerk behind the counter thanks him as if he has performed a civic duty. Borrowing for war is not inherently reckless. Wars are urgent, and spreading costs across time can be rational. But borrowing shifts the burden into the structure of the future. It assumes the future will cooperate. It assumes the tax base will be strong enough to pay interest and principal. It assumes the unit in which obligations are measured will remain meaningful. It assumes political authority will survive long enough to enforce the bargain. During the war, the financial machinery initially worked. The Reichsbank supported the market for government paper, providing liquidity and helping the system absorb enormous issuance. Controls and disruptions altered normal trade, but the idea of the mark as a stable unit remained largely intact. Prices rose, yet the rise did not feel like collapse. In wartime, many things rise: scarcity, anxiety, grief. Inflation can hide in that noise, especially when the public expects a return to normal once the guns fall silent and trade routes reopen. A young infantryman on leave visits a cafe with his brother, who works in a factory producing components for the front. They compare pay. The soldier's wages feel thin against the cost of food, but the gap does not yet seem unbridgeable. They speak of the war as if it has an endpoint that will restore order. In that assumption lies the first vulnerability. Inflation is easier to tolerate when people believe it is temporary. The empire also trained the public to treat money as something the state could manage by decree. Rationing, price guidance, and wartime regulations reshaped daily life. Savings were encouraged into government paper. When taxation is avoided, inflation becomes a substitute, an invisible levy paid through higher prices and diluted claims. The Reichsbank did not merely run printing presses, it discounted treasury bills and other paper, turning state needs into circulating means of payment. Each step looked practical. Taken together, they blurred the line between financing and money. By 1918, the situation had changed. The blockade and disruption strained supplies. The state's finances were stretched. Borrowing continued because the alternatives were politically difficult and because the war had become existential. The mark was still used, but the balance behind it was thinning. What mattered was not only the quantity of notes, but the credibility of the post-war plan. When a government's promises are anchored to victory, defeat does not merely change borders, it changes what lenders believe they will actually receive. In a Berlin print shop producing official forms, a foreman watches the piles of paper grow. During the war, he printed posters and ration cards. Now he prints more documents, more notices, more certificates. The machines do not understand politics. They only respond to orders, yet the growing volume of paper is a signal, even if no one says it aloud. A state issuing more claims than it can tax is a state leaning on belief. The armistice arrived with exhaustion, humiliation, and uncertainty. The imperial government fell, and a republic was born into ruins. The new state inherited obligations measured in a currency already weakened. It inherited a population accustomed to the idea that extraordinary costs could be met by issuing claims. A habit had formed. When the bill is unbearable, postpone it. The war loan certificates in drawers across Germany did not vanish when the Kaiser abdicated. They remained as paper promises, and therefore as a moral claim. Citizens had lent to the nation now owed them. If the new republic could not honor that obligation in real terms, it faced not only an economic constraint, but a legitimacy problem. The unit of account is not neutral. It is the instrument through which society decides what debts mean. This is why Weimar's hyperinflation cannot be understood as a sudden loss of discipline in 1923. The trap was set earlier, in the wartime choice to fund the conflict through borrowing, with central bank support, and with the expectation that the future would pay. When the future arrived in defeat, the Republic inherited both the arithmetic and the habit. It had to keep paying wages, benefits, and interest while rebuilding a shattered economy and confronting external demands. In the next chapter, we step into those demands. Reparations, political instability, and a weakened tax system will tighten around the mark. The teacher's certificate will still look respectable, but its meaning will begin to shift, not because the paper changes, but because the future it relied upon has changed. Defeat did not end Germany's financial problem, it transformed it. The new republic inherited the obligations of the empire, but it did not inherit the imperial aura that had made those obligations feel unshakable. It inherited debt, disrupted trade, damaged infrastructure, and a population divided over who was responsible and who should suffer. At the same time, the state still had to operate: wages for civil servants, benefits for veterans, subsidies for food and fuel, maintenance of railways, policing, and the interest on the swelling wartime overhang. In 1919 and 1920, the mark weakened in foreign exchange markets. Some of this reflected shortages and trade deficits, but much of it reflected anticipation. If the state would need to make payments abroad, investors demanded more marks for each dollar, pound, or franc. The exchange rate became a public verdict. It measured confidence not only in money, but in the political ability to reconcile competing claims. A small import merchant in Hamburg checks the day's rate posted by his bank. He needs dollars to buy coffee and cotton. The number has moved again, not by a little. He recalculates prices, then recalculates again, and feels as if he is trying to build a house on sand. He is not speculating for sport, he is trying to keep his business alive. Yet the very act of chasing foreign currency contributes to the mark's weakening, because fear and necessity look the same in a market. Reparations intensified every dilemma. They were not merely a sum, they were a continuing negotiation over capacity, accountability, and enforcement. Within Germany, many viewed them as unjust and humiliating. Abroad, many viewed them as the price of destruction and a guarantee against renewed aggression. For the Weimar government, the problem was practical. Obligations denominated in foreign currency or gold could not be met by issuing paper marks. If the state needed to transfer real resources abroad, it had to obtain foreign currency through exports or borrowing, and both depended on confidence. Domestic politics turned fiscal policy into a battlefield. Taxing wealth provoked resistance, cutting benefits provoked unrest, raising indirect taxes hit the poor and threatened strikes, borrowing at home competed with private credit and depended on trust. In this environment, the currency became a pressure valve. If deficits were covered through central bank credit, the confrontation with voters could be postponed. Inflation spread the cost across society in a way that was hard to trace to a single law or a single vote. In the streets, the fragility of authority was not an abstract idea. In Berlin, workers remembered the barricades of 1918 and 1919. In 1920, when a putsch briefly seized parts of the capital, civil servants faced a question no budget line can answer: which government is real? Some refused orders, some waited, some complied, and all watched the mark with new nervousness. A currency is a claim on the future, and the future is hard to price when the state itself appears temporary. Rumor became economics, and hesitation became policy. When people sense that authority may not last, they shorten horizons. They buy goods sooner, demand higher wages sooner, and convert savings into anything that seems firmer for now. One afternoon in 1920, a municipal cashier lays out pay for a line of clerks. The notes are new, crisp, official, and yet every face carries the same question: how fast must I turn this into goods? A few employees leave early to shop before prices change. Supervisors pretend not to notice because they do the same. This is how inflation reshapes institutions from the inside. Time moves away from production toward protection. Tax collection suffered from a problem that was administrative in form and monetary in consequence: delay. Assessments had to be made, notices delivered, payments processed. In stable times, delay is tolerable. Under inflation, delay becomes a fiscal disaster. By the time revenue arrives, it buys less. A tax official in a medium-sized city watches this happen in slow motion. He sends out bills in marks. Debtors pay weeks later. The nominal amount seems large, yet the office cannot buy coal for the building. By 1921, reparations were set in a more concrete framework. The sums and schedules implied burdens that German leaders argued were impossible without destroying the economy. They sought delays and renegotiation. Foreign governments sought compliance. Each crisis in negotiation weakened confidence further. The currency suffered, and as it suffered, fiscal arithmetic worsened because the state's costs rose in nominal terms while its real revenues eroded. This is the first major feedback loop of Weimar. A weaker mark makes the budget harder, and a harder budget makes the mark weaker. In cafes, conversation changed tone. People still argued about parties and coalitions, but they also discussed prices and exchange rates. What had once been a background concern became a daily calculation. A woman saving for a child's coat watches the amount in her envelope lose meaning between Monday and Friday. A landlord asks for rent adjustments. A union representative demands higher wages, not because workers feel richer, but because they are trying not to fall behind. It would be comforting to imagine that officials failed to understand economics. Many understood the danger. They also faced constraints that were not technical, but political. A republic born amid revolution, counter-revolution, attempted coups, and street violence did not have the quiet authority to impose austerity easily. Compromise felt necessary, and compromise cost money. Inflation, at first, seemed to hold society together by avoiding explicit choices. But bridges, built of paper, do not carry weight forever. In the next chapter, we will watch inflation become routine, and then something more than routine. We will see how adaptation becomes acceleration and how the mark begins to lose not just value, but its role as a stable measure of the world. Inflation, once it becomes routine, stops feeling like an emergency and starts behaving like a system. In 1921 and into 1922, many Germans lived inside this system without yet believing it would end in catastrophe. The mark was weaker, prices were higher, wages adjusted upward, and business continued. People adapted, and adaptation created a kind of false stability. When a society learns a new rhythm, it can look as if the rhythm is sustainable. The exchange rate was the most visible indicator. Newspapers printed daily quotations for the dollar and the pound, and these figures migrated into ordinary conversation. A man who had never traveled abroad could still tell you what the mark did yesterday. The foreign rate became a thermometer of national confidence, and like any thermometer, it could also become a cause of fever. When merchants expected the mark to fall further, they raised prices to protect themselves. When workers saw prices rising, they demanded higher pay to avoid falling behind. Each decision was reasonable. Together, they accelerated the cycle. A shopkeeper on a Berlin side street keeps a slate beside the cash register. Several times a day, she wipes it clean and writes new prices. She does not enjoy this. She would prefer predictable customers and predictable margins. But her suppliers demand cash and warn her that next week will be worse. She therefore prices today as if tomorrow will be dearer. Customers accuse her of greed. She accuses the wholesalers. The wholesalers accuse the currency. The currency has no voice. Meanwhile, she keeps a small reserve of soap and coffee under the counter, because these goods hold value longer than her drawer of notes. This is how inflation shifts behavior. Money is designed to be the most liquid asset, the easiest thing to trade, and therefore the easiest thing to hold. Under inflation, goods become the better store of value. People hoard inventories, not because they are irrational, but because paper decays. The consequence is shortage, even when production is not collapsed. Shelves look emptier, queues lengthen, anger rises. Each visible shortage teaches the public another lesson: spend faster. The state learned the same lesson through a different channel. Taxes are collected with delay. Assessments must be made, notices delivered, payments processed. In stable times, that delay is an administrative detail. Under inflation, delay becomes a fiscal wound. By the time revenue arrives, it buys less. Even if nominal tax rates rise, real revenue can shrink. The state then runs deficits even when it tries to collect more. It covers deficits by borrowing or by drawing on central bank credit, which expands the money supply and reinforces expectations. A senior official in a ministry reviews budget requests. Every department claims its appropriations are inadequate. Railways need funds, schools need coal, police need boots. The official knows that each request is both true and impossible. If he grants them, the deficit widens. If he denies them, the state stops functioning. He signs approvals and tells himself that the compromise is temporary, that order will soon return. In the meantime, he is financing continuity with money that will not hold still. Inflation also created an illusion of prosperity for some. Debtors found that the real burden of their obligations shrank. Industrial firms with access to credit could borrow and repay in cheaper money. Asset owners saw nominal values rise. Exporters benefited when foreign buyers found German goods cheap. In certain circles, inflation looked like an engine that rewarded boldness and punished caution. This perception mattered. It weakened the coalition for stabilization, because stabilization requires someone to stop benefiting and to accept a slower, harder form of adjustment. In a factory office in the Ruhr, a bookkeeper posts wages for the week and sees the numbers swell beyond anything his father would have believed. The workers are not celebrating. They ask when the next adjustment will come and whether pay can be advanced. The foreman agrees because a stoppage would cost more than the paperwork. On payday, the men and women leave the gates and split into small groups, each assigned to buy something specific: bread, coal, meat, candles, before prices move again. Such behavior is sometimes described as panic, but it is better described as rational flight from money. When people expect the mark to lose value quickly, they reduce their cash balances and accelerate transactions. This raises the velocity of money, and velocity is what turns high inflation into hyperinflation. The same stock of notes circulates faster, chasing the same goods more urgently, and the price level responds with violent speed. Even the state begins to act this way. paying suppliers early and pushing payments forward because delay has become a tax. Local improvisation filled the gaps. Cities and firms issued emergency notes, not geld, because small change vanished and banks could not supply enough paper of suitable denominations. A tram conductor in a nearby town accepts a brightly printed slip from a passenger and tucks it into a metal box. He knows the note is only valid within the district and only for a short time, yet it keeps the service moving. Such substitutes were practical, but they carried a quiet message. The national unit was no longer enough. When money fragments, trust fragments with it, and the country learns to live on provisional agreements. Every new workaround reduced the urgency to demand a final solution. By late 1922, the unit of account was losing credibility. Contracts became shorter. Prices were increasingly linked to foreign currency or to informal indexing. The economy began to split into two layers: the paper layer, where marks multiplied, and the real layer, where people tried to secure goods, foreign exchange, and hard assets. The mark was still used, but it was no longer trusted to stand still. In the next chapter, we will focus on speed itself. We will see why hyperinflation is not only about how many notes exist, but about how urgently everyone tries to get rid of them, and what happens when that urgency becomes the normal way to live. In late 1922, the mark's decline began to feel less like drift and more like descent. The change was not only numerical, it was a shift in how people related to the currency. In earlier inflation, households complained and adjusted. Now they began to anticipate. Anticipation is the hinge on which hyperinflation turns. Once everyone believes the unit of account will be weaker tomorrow, everyone behaves as if tomorrow must be outrun. A bank clerk arrives before opening and finds a queue already formed outside the doors. The customers are not withdrawing because they mistrust the bank's solvency. They are withdrawing because they mistrust time. They want cash in hand so they can purchase goods immediately, convert marks into foreign currency, or repay debts before prices rise again. Inside, the clerk stamps forms and counts notes, and the routine looks normal, but the faces in the line are tense. The notes have become hot stones, something to pass along before they burn your hand. Businesses reacted in ways that were rational individually and destructive collectively. Wholesalers shortened payment terms, retailers repriced more frequently, workers demanded wage adjustments more often, and employers granted them because a stoppage would cost more than a new wage scale. Landlords sought clauses that protected rent. Professional associations debated linking payments to foreign currency or gold, not as a political gesture, but as a survival tactic. The economy was trying to rebuild its contracts while the measuring stick kept shrinking. A foreman at a machine works out a new ritual with the payroll office. Instead of paying weekly, they pay twice a week. Then they pay every other day. Soon, they pay at midday as well as at closing, because the men insist that waiting until evening costs them dinner. The foreman watches as workers rush from the gate to the nearest shops, sometimes leaving tools on benches, sometimes sending children ahead with baskets. Prices are revised while they stand in line. Some merchants refuse notes altogether unless they can immediately spend them at the wholesaler across the street. In courtyards and stairwells, neighbors begin to swap. A sack of potatoes for a pair of boots, a bottle of lamp oil for a week of childcare. Money has not vanished, but it is no longer trusted to bridge time. When the bridge fails, people shorten their lives to the scale of today, and every shortening makes tomorrow shakier. Even those who still accepted marks began quoting two prices, one if paid now, another if paid later, because later meant loss, and loss meant anger for everyone involved. In such an environment, the role of the central bank becomes unavoidable. The Reichsbank was not merely a printing office. It was a lender, a discounting institution, and the mechanism through which the state could transform short-term needs into circulating claims. When the Treasury ran short, it issued short-term paper. When banks and firms held that paper, they brought it to the Reichsbank to be discounted for cash. This process expanded the money supply and, just as importantly, signaled that the state would meet obligations by issuing claims that the public was expected to accept. A printer at the Reichsdruckerei watches pallets of notes roll off machines. he notices denominations rising. What were once small notes become larger notes, then larger still. New. Designs appear quickly, sometimes with mistakes, because speed matters more than elegance. The notes smell of fresh ink. He is proud of his craft, yet he senses a futility he cannot name. The more efficiently he works, the less any single note seems to mean. Here, the mistake is to imagine that hyperinflation is simply more money equals higher prices. Quantity matters, but it is filtered through expectations. If people expect the mark to lose value, they spend faster. If they spend faster, prices rise faster. If prices rise faster, the state's nominal costs rise faster and deficits widen. If deficits widen, the Treasury relies more on Reichsbank credit. The loop tightens. Each round makes the next round easier to believe. This is the psychology of erosion. Foreign exchange strengthened the loop. Many essential imports were priced relative to dollars, pounds, or gold. As the mark fell, import costs rose. Firms passed those costs into domestic prices. The public saw exchange rates in newspapers and treated them as forecasts. When the dollar rose, shopkeepers raised prices preemptively, not out of malice, but out of fear of being caught with inventory priced too low. A market number became a social signal. A widow in Leipzig receives her pension and goes to buy coal. The dealer quotes a price valid only for that morning. She returns home to fetch more notes because she has not carried enough. When she returns, the price has changed. The dealer is not mocking her. He is protecting himself. His supplier demands payment on delivery, and the supplier's supplier demands the same. The widow's pension arrives on a schedule. Coal is priced on a heartbeat. She begins to trade linens and household items because objects are steadier than numbers. Meanwhile, the state's administrative time lag became a macroeconomic force. Taxes assessed in marks arrived late in marks, and those marks bought less. To maintain services, the state spent more. To spend more, it borrowed more. To borrow more, it leaned on the central bank. This is how a technical delay becomes a national hazard. Institutions built for ordinary time were being asked to operate in accelerated time, and they could not. By the end of 1922, the economy had learned the habit of speed. Money moved quickly because no one wanted to be last. The next phase will show what happens when an external shock meets this internal fragility. When confidence is already thin, events do not merely cause fear, they validate fear. In early 1923, Germany would face a confrontation that turned rapid inflation into a collapse that people could feel hour by hour, in wages, in bread, and in the meaning of the mark itself. In January 1923, the crisis that had been forming in ledgers and exchange tables stepped into the street. Germany fell behind on deliveries connected to reparations, and the response was not another round of patient negotiation. French and Belgian troops moved into the Ruhr, the industrial basin that produced coal and steel, and they treated the occupation as an instrument of enforcement. For Germany, the Ruhr was not merely a region on a map. It was the engine room of output, wages, and tax capacity. If the engine room is seized or slowed, the whole state begins to feel the vibration. A railway clerk in Essen watches unfamiliar uniforms on the platforms and feels a private panic he cannot name. The trains still run, but orders come from new authorities, and every routine task carries political meaning. In the station office, colleagues argue about whether compliance is betrayal or survival. Outside, workers gather in small knots, listening for instructions and scanning notice boards for new rules. At home that evening, his wife asks whether his pay will arrive and whether the mark will buy coal if it does. He has no answer. The occupation is not only a military event, it is a disruption to the daily mechanisms that hold prices, wages, and expectations together. The government in Berlin chose a response that seemed, at first, to defend dignity without surrender. It called for passive resistance. Workers were urged not to cooperate with the occupiers. Officials were urged to refuse directives. In practice, this meant strikes, slowdowns, and administrative refusal. The Republic would not fight with rifles. It would fight by withholding labor. Yet withholding labor has a price. Wages still had to be paid, families still had to eat, and the machinery of government still had to be kept from seizing up. A paymaster in a municipal office opens a schedule for the month and sees how quickly the sums have changed. The numbers are large, yet the coffers feel empty. He pays. Railway staff working under pressure, and miners whose output is being throttled by policy because the state has asked them to resist. He pays clerks who file refusals and teachers who keep schools open. Each payment is a political statement, and each payment is also a budget decision. The Republic is buying resistance with money that is already losing meaning. This is where Weimar's inflation dynamic turned into something sharper. Passive resistance exploded the deficit. Tax revenue from the Ruhr fell as production faltered and as collection became more difficult. Coal deliveries slowed, industrial output declined, and disruptions spread beyond the occupied region through transport and supply chains. Meanwhile, the government increased spending to support workers and firms affected by the occupation and to subsidize essentials that were becoming more expensive as the currency weakened. The gap between what the state collected and what it promised widened into a chasm. Inside the Einobad Reichsbank, the crisis appeared not as slogans, but as paper. Treasury officials brought short-term obligations and asked for advances. Banks brought bills and asked for discounting. Firms arrived seeking credit to cover payroll while deliveries and contracts were disrupted. The central bank, faced with the fear of stoppage and disorder, chose continuity. It provided liquidity because to refuse would be to force a sudden fiscal reckoning that politics could not absorb. But liquidity in this setting was not neutral support. It was the creation of claims in a unit that the public was increasingly trying to escape. A printer at the Reichsdruckerei sees new denominations introduced as if they were warnings. Where once tens and hundreds sufficed, now thousands become ordinary. A foreman tells his staff to ignore the absurdity of zeros and focus on output because ministries are waiting, banks are waiting, and post offices are waiting. The notes are legal tender. They are also a confession that yesterday's unit no longer fits today's prices. Each new note makes transactions possible for a short while, and each one quietly teaches the public that money will continue to change form without regaining stability. The occupation tightened the link between exchange rates and domestic life. Foreign currency prices rose because markets expected Germany to struggle to earn and transfer real resources. The mark fell, and that fall raised the cost of imported goods and raw materials. Firms raised prices to protect inventories and to cover replacement costs. Workers demanded higher pay to protect dinners and rent. The loop that had operated in 1922 now had an accelerant, a national emergency that justified extraordinary spending. Because that spending was financed through monetary expansion, the emergency also confirmed the market's fear, and fear moved the exchange rate again. In Berlin cafes, people argued about the Ruhr as if it were a distant battlefield, yet they watched their own receipts and realized the battlefield was also in the bakery line. A civil servant's salary arrived more often, but it bought less. A landlord demanded rent adjustments weekly. A shopkeeper changed prices twice in one afternoon and apologized as if apology could stabilize numbers. The Republic had entered a new phase, the phase where the public no longer asked whether inflation would stop soon, but how fast it would get worse. Still, many clung to the idea that the crisis would be solved by politics. Perhaps foreign governments would relent, perhaps a new agreement would be reached, perhaps production would resume. Hope matters because hope is a component of belief, and belief is the substance of money. Yet hope in 1923 was being asked to carry too much weight. When the state must pay for resistance today and can only pay in a unit shrinking by the week, the unit itself begins to feel provisional. In the next chapter, we will stay in the Ruhr and watch passive resistance as a lived policy. We will see how paying people not to work can be both a moral stance and an economic accelerant, and how the attempt to preserve legitimacy pushed the currency closer to the edge. Passive resistance sounds quiet, almost bloodless, until you see what it demands day after day. It asked workers to refuse cooperation while still remaining alive. It asked firms to endure disruption while still meeting payroll. It asked local officials to resist directives while still keeping water running, trams moving, and schools open. This was not merely a political tactic. It became a national subsidy program built around defiance, and it was financed in a currency already strained. In a coal town near the occupied lines, a mine foreman walks past the gates and sees men gathered with hands in pockets, waiting for the next instruction. They are not lazy. They are trapped between forces larger than their wages. The foreman knows that if output collapses, the town's shops will suffer, transport will slow, and tax receipts will shrink. He also knows that if workers cooperate, they may be branded traitors, and the state may abandon them. In the evening, he sits at a kitchen table with his accounts and tries to calculate a week ahead. By the time he finishes, the numbers are already wrong. The government's commitment to pay for non-cooperation widened the deficit with brutal speed. If you ask why, the answer is mechanical. If production falls, tax revenue falls. If railways are disrupted, commerce slows. If industry is uncertain, credit tightens. Meanwhile, spending rises because the state is paying wages, supporting firms, and maintaining services under stress. In normal times, a government can borrow to bridge a temporary shock. In Weimar, borrowing depended on confidence in a unit of account that was losing credibility. As confidence thinned, borrowing became costlier and the fallback became money creation. A cashier in a local savings bank watches depositors behave as if the bank's door is a trap. They do not withdraw because they expect the bank to fail overnight. They withdraw because they expect the mark to fail. Each man takes bundles of notes, not to hide them, but to spend them quickly. The cashier stamps withdrawal slips with a tired hand. He has stamped so many that the act itself feels meaningless. In an older world, deposits were patience. Now deposits are hesitation, and hesitation is punished. The Reichsbank could have refused to extend credit, but refusal would have meant immediate collapse of payments the Republic had publicly promised. It would have meant mass unemployment and social disorder during an occupation crisis. The central bank therefore continued to discount paper and to extend credit to keep the system moving. The intention was continuity. The effect was acceleration. When the state's deficit is financed through monetary expansion and the public already expects depreciation, the act of financing becomes a signal that validates the expectation. In the Ruhr, people began to experience policy as a physical sensation, a tightening in the chest when prices were read aloud, a tightening in the stomach when coal was rationed, a tightening in the pace of walking as wages were spent faster. A shopkeeper who once bought inventory weekly now tries to buy it daily. He pays wholesalers immediately because delayed payment means a higher bill. The wholesaler, in turn, is desperate to replace stock with goods before money loses value. The whole chain becomes a race. Even language began to shift. People spoke less of saving and more of protecting. They spoke less of prices and more of today's price, as if tomorrow belonged to another world. Clerks kept notebooks of conversions to foreign currency, not for travel, but for mental stability. A unit of account is a tool for thinking. When it fails, thinking becomes more difficult and fear becomes easier. A schoolteacher in a small city receives her salary and sees that it is higher than last month, and yet it feels like an insult because it buys less. She spends the afternoon in queues instead of preparing lessons. She buys bread, then coal, then anything she can carry that might still be useful later. At night, she writes in a diary that she has become a trader in necessities, not a teacher. Hyperinflation does not only change numbers, it rearranges lives. The occupation also deepened the sense that Germany's fate was being judged by outsiders and that the domestic currency was therefore not fully sovereign. This perception matters because money is confidence in an authority. If authority feels constrained, money feels fragile. The mark fell further, and the fall translated into higher prices for imported inputs and goods. Those higher prices fed wage demands fed costs fed more calls for state support. The loop tightened again. By the summer, many Germans would remember the Ruhr crisis as the moment the slope became a cliff. But a cliff is not a single step. It is the accumulation of steps in which each compromise narrows the next option. Passive resistance narrowed options quickly. It forced the state to choose between visible humiliation and invisible inflation. The Republic chose inflation because inflation seemed, for a time, like the least immediate pain. In the next chapter, we will follow the mark into everyday markets. We will see how businesses and households adapted to faster depreciation, how emergency money proliferated, and how the ordinary act of buying bread became an encounter with a collapsing unit of account. When inflation accelerates, the first thing that changes is not ideology but routine. People still wake, work, buy, and pay. The difference is that each routine action becomes time-sensitive. The value of money depends on how quickly it can be converted into something else. As 1923 progressed, the act of shopping began to resemble a form of emergency planning. A factory worker in Berlin receives pay at midday. The foreman has learned that waiting until evening invites anger because the same wages buy less by night. The worker takes a bundle of notes tied with string and walks fast, not for exercise, but for preservation. At a butcher's shop, the price of sausage is posted on a board. While he waits, the butcher steps out, erases a number, and writes a higher one. No one protests. The worker buys less than planned, then moves to a bakery, then to a coal dealer, trying to convert paper into calories and heat before paper thins again. This behavior is rational, and it is contagious. The more people rush to spend, the faster money circulates. The faster it circulates, the more pressure it places on limited goods. The more pressure, the faster prices rise. Hyperinflation is not only an expansion of money, it is an acceleration of spending. It is the moment when the public treats money not as a store of value, but as a liability that must be disposed of. Businesses adapted by shortening horizons. Merchants repriced constantly. Wholesalers demanded cash on delivery. Credit terms shrank from months to weeks, from weeks to days, and then disappeared altogether. Even when sellers accepted marks, they often accepted them only with an immediate plan to spend them. The moment a merchant receives money, he must either replace inventory at once or risk being unable to replace it later. Money becomes a temporary permission slip rather than a stable tool. In some towns, the shortage of suitable denominations produced an additional improvisation. Emergency money. Municipalities, firms, and local associations issued their own notes, not Geld, to keep trade functioning when coins vanished and official small notes were scarce. A tram conductor accepts a brightly printed slip from a passenger and drops it into a metal box. The slip is valid only for a short time and only in that locality, yet it keeps the tram moving. Such substitutes are practical, but they carry a message. The national unit is no longer sufficient to manage daily exchange. A shopkeeper in a smaller city keeps two cash drawers. One drawer holds official marks. The other holds local notes, foreign coins, and goods that can be traded. When customers arrive with wages, she accepts them, but turns around quickly to pay her supplier, because holding money is risk. She also barters quietly with a neighbor, soap for flour, candles for potatoes. The shopkeeper has not lost faith in society. She has lost faith in the unit that society uses to measure itself. Tax collection became increasingly surreal. Taxes are obligations measured in money, and when money loses meaning between assessment and payment, the obligation becomes hollow. A municipal tax clerk sends out bills that look official and carefully typed. Debtors pay late, and their late payments still count as payments, yet they arrive with reduced real value. The city's ability to buy coal, maintain roads, and pay staff declines. This creates an additional pressure for the state to spend more to maintain services, and spending more widens deficits, and deficits demand more monetary financing. Administrative time, which used to be a detail, becomes a driver of national instability. Even wages, the most personal connection between labor and money, began to lose their anchoring function. Wage negotiations turned into negotiations about timing rather than about levels. Workers demanded more frequent payments. Employers agreed to prevent stoppages, but frequent payments increased the speed of money circulation. What had been a defensive measure became part of the mechanism of acceleration. Each actor tried to survive, and survival reproduced the conditions of collapse. A widow who once kept her pension in an envelope now spends it within hours. She buys bread and preserves, then exchanges a portion for a small bag of coal, then trades a scarf for potatoes. She keeps a few notes out of habit, but she does not trust them, and she does not know why she keeps them. They are remnants of an older rule, like a calendar from another year that has not yet been thrown away. This is the social cost that cannot be captured by price indices. Hyperinflation forces people to live in a constant present. Planning becomes difficult. Contracts become short. The mental space that once held education, craft, and family ambition is crowded out by the urgent arithmetic of survival. Society becomes more transactional and less patient, not because people have become worse, but because the instrument that allowed patience has broken. And yet, even now, many still believed the Republic might regain control through a political settlement. Perhaps passive resistance would end under terms that saved face. Perhaps the occupation would ease. Perhaps foreign loans would arrive. Such hopes were not foolish. They were attempts to preserve belief in a future that money could once again measure. In the next chapter, we will watch what happens when belief continues to thin. We will follow the mark as it begins to move, not in small steps, but in leaps, and we will see how velocity and expectations can turn a severe inflation into a currency collapse. By mid-1923, Germany's inflation was no longer a problem measured by monthly statistics. It was a problem measured by the pace of a day. Prices rose so quickly that yesterday's numbers felt like antiques. The exchange rate became a kind of drumbeat, and each new beat announced that the unit of account had shrunk again. In this phase, people did not simply respond to inflation, they anticipated it, and anticipation became the dominant force. A wholesaler in Leipzig opens his warehouse early and meets his buyers with a rule that would have sounded insane a year earlier. Prices are valid for 1 hour. He is not trying to profit from confusion. He is trying to protect himself from the gap between selling and restocking. If he sells at a price set yesterday, he may not be able to replace inventory at all. He therefore prices as if the currency will be weaker by noon, because experience has taught him that it will be. Buyers accept the rule because they too are trying to outrun depreciation. When the entire chain behaves this way, money loses the ability to coordinate. Accounting becomes fiction in this environment. A unit of account is supposed to allow a business to calculate costs, revenues, and profit. When the unit changes constantly, calculation becomes a form of guessing. Firms revise their books repeatedly. They try to index values to foreign currency or to goods. They treat inventory as the true asset and cash as a temporary inconvenience. These adaptations are rational, but they also signal to workers and customers that money is no longer the core measure. The signal spreads. A bank clerk who once took pride in neat ledgers now feels he is writing on water. Deposits come in and leave quickly. Clients ask for foreign exchange or for goods-backed instruments. The clerk stamps forms, counts notes, and sees that his own salary, though larger, is thinner. He begins to take payment advances. He begins to bring lunch from home because cafe prices change while he is at the counter. He notices that his colleagues talk about numbers the way sailors talk about wind. They do not believe they can stop it. They believe they can only adjust their sails. The state's predicament worsened because its costs rose in nominal terms faster than it could collect real revenue. The lag in tax collection became devastating. Even when tax rates were increased, the interval between assessment and payment erased much of the real value. The state therefore relied more on monetary financing to cover payrolls, subsidies, and the costs of passive resistance. This is where the fiscal and monetary crises fused. Hyperinflation is not a separate disaster that happens beside politics. It is a political economy in which fiscal weakness and monetary expansion chase each other in a tightening loop. Rural areas experienced the crisis differently, and this difference mattered. Farmers and rural producers often held goods that could be traded directly. They could demand payment in kind or demand prices that adjusted instantly. Urban workers held wages, which arrived in paper. A farmer near a market town brings potatoes to sell and refuses the first offers in marks, not out of malice, but out of distrust. He prefers tools, kerosene, cloth, and shoes. City buyers complain, but the farmer's calculation is straightforward. He cannot pay his hired hands with promises that evaporate. He cannot buy seed and equipment with paper that shrinks between morning and afternoon. This divergence intensifies social tension. Urban dwellers accuse farmers of hoarding and profiteering. Farmers accuse urban authorities of trying to seize food at controlled prices. The state tries to mediate with regulations and requisitions, but regulations in a collapsing unit of account are weak. They are commands measured in a currency that no longer commands. A schoolboy carries a bundle of notes to buy a loaf of bread and returns with change in the form of more notes because coins have disappeared from daily life. He sees his mother count the stack and sigh, not because she feels rich, but because she knows the stack is a problem to solve quickly. The boy learns an early lesson. Money is not a treasure. Money is a task. It must be converted, managed, exchanged before it decays. By this stage, price setting became less about cost and more about expectation. Sellers ask themselves not what did it cost, but what will it cost to replace. Replacement cost depends on future currency value, and future currency value depends on belief. The economy becomes a mirror reflecting collective fear. As fear rises, velocity rises. As velocity rises, prices rise. As prices rise, fear feels justified. The mirror feeds the face that stares into it. If a currency is shared, belief made measurable, then hyperinflation is shared, disbelief made visible. It is disbelief in the ability of institutions to stop issuing claims, disbelief in the stability of law when obligations are rewritten by inflation, disbelief in the future as a place where promises can be kept. In the next chapter, we will look directly at winners and losers because hyperinflation does not treat everyone equally. We will see how debt becomes a gift to some and a curse to others, and how the unequal distribution of damage shapes the politics of stabilization. Hyperinflation is sometimes described as a disaster that strikes a nation as a single body, but it is more precise to say it rearranges the nation's internal balance. It does not distribute pain evenly. It rewards certain positions and destroys others. Those rewards and destructions matter, because they shape how long a society tolerates inflation and how difficult stabilization becomes. A small businessman who borrowed before prices accelerated discovers that his debt is shrinking in real terms. His monthly payments, though rising in nominal numbers, feel lighter relative to what his goods sell for. He pays back loans with currency that buys less and less, and he feels a secret relief that borders on guilt. He is not stealing, yet he is benefiting from a hidden transfer. Meanwhile, his neighbor, who kept savings in a bank account, watches those savings become meaningless. The two men live on the same street and experience the same economy as two different worlds. Wage earners stood in a precarious middle. Some unions won frequent wage adjustments, and some industries paid more often, but wages typically lagged behind prices in crucial moments. The gap was not always large on paper, but it was large at the counter. A factory worker may receive a raise that looks generous, yet the raise arrives after prices have already moved. The worker's life becomes a constant attempt to close a gap that reopens each week. He is always slightly late to the market, and lateness has become expensive. Pensioners and fixed-income households suffered most visibly. Their claims were fixed in a unit that was failing. A widow on a pension might receive an adjustment eventually, but adjustment arrives after erosion. The pension is a promise measured in money, and when money becomes paper, the promise dissolves. This is not only an economic loss, it is a moral shock. People who lived prudently discover that prudence was not protection. The social contract breaks quietly in their kitchens. Owners of real assets were often protected. Land, buildings, machinery, foreign currency claims, and inventories rose in nominal value as money fell. Large firms with access to credit could borrow, acquire assets, and repay with depreciated currency. Exporters benefited because a falling mark made their goods cheaper abroad. Some individuals learned to speculate in foreign exchange or commodities, and they appeared to others as profiteers. The public's anger focused on these visible winners, even when the deeper mechanism was structural. A clerk in a city office watches a new type of customer arrive at the bank, men who speak quickly, carry briefcases, and ask about dollars and Swiss francs. They are not smug. They are urgent. They want any foothold outside the mark. The clerk hears rumors that some have made fortunes by buying goods early and selling later. He also hears rumors that others have lost everything by being late to the turn. The bank's lobby becomes a theater of anxiety, and money becomes not a tool of stability, but a contest of timing. These unequal outcomes weaken the political coalition for stabilization. Stabilization requires hard measures, fiscal consolidation, limits on central bank financing, and a credible new unit of account. Such measures inevitably hurt some interests. Debtors fear that stabilization will freeze debts in a stronger currency and make repayment harder. Exporters fear that stabilization will strengthen the currency and reduce competitiveness. Workers fear wage restraint. Politicians fear backlash. Yet without stabilization, the losers multiply and the state itself risks losing the capacity to govern. A shopkeeper who once accepted marks without thought now hesitates. She posts prices, but she also watches who pays and with what. A customer offers foreign coin and is served quickly. Another offers marks and is served with a look that is not disdain but calculation. The shopkeeper has become a currency judge, not by choice but by necessity. In such moments, money's failure becomes social. It changes how people see each other. It introduces suspicion into ordinary exchange. The public debate often reduces the crisis to a moral argument: who is greedy, who is patriotic, who is betraying the EU nation. But hyperinflation is not best explained by personal sin. It is best explained by incentives and constraints. When the state cannot raise real revenue fast enough and cannot borrow credibly, it turns to monetary financing. When the public expects depreciation, it accelerates spending. When spending accelerates, prices accelerate. The machine runs on its own momentum until belief is rebuilt by a decisive change. That decisive change did not arrive immediately. Before stabilization could occur, the crisis would have to reach a point where the costs of continuing became greater than the costs of stopping. In politics, such thresholds are often reached only after exhaustion. In 1923, exhaustion was approaching. In the next part, we will follow the crisis into its peak, when money's meaning drains so quickly that hourly life becomes a form of improvisation, and when Germany is forced to consider a new anchor that is not paper, but belief enforced by fiscal reality. In the late summer of 1923, the mark began to move in a way that broke the mind's older habits. People were used to higher prices. They were even used to fast repricing. Now the scale changed. The numbers grew so large that ordinary speech stumbled. A loaf of bread, a tram ticket, a newspaper. Each required bundles of notes that looked theatrical and felt humiliating. The currency did not merely lose value, it lost its ability to be pictured. A typist in Berlin receives her wages in the afternoon, paid in thick stacks wrapped with paper bands. She carries them home in a shopping basket because a purse is no longer sufficient. On the way, she stops at a market stall and asks the price of eggs. The seller answers, then adds, "For the next 10 minutes." The typist does not argue. She counts quickly, hands over the notes, and takes the eggs as if they were fragile glass. The seller turns immediately to a neighboring stall and spends the notes on flour and fat, because by evening, the same bundle will buy less. At this stage, prices did not rise only because more notes existed. They rose because the meaning of the unit evaporated and because everyone adjusted behavior to that evaporation. The velocity of money became a visible force. Wages were spent the moment they were received. Merchants paid suppliers the moment they were paid. Suppliers bought inputs the moment they received payment. The same notes raced through hands like a message that no one wanted to keep. Money became a hot coal, and every hand tried to pass it on before the heat increased. The state's fiscal position was trapped in accelerated time. The tax collection lag, which had been painful, became fatal. A tax assessed in marks at the beginning of a month was nearly worthless by the time it arrived. Even well-intentioned citizens could not keep up with the calendar of obligation. Some paid early to avoid guilt, others paid late because they had no choice. Many paid with numbers that no longer represented real resources. The Treasury therefore leaned harder on short-term credit and on Reichsbank advances, converting fiscal delay into monetary expansion. A civil servant in a ministry keeps a notebook of exchange rates, updating it from newspapers and from rumor. His task is to pay suppliers for office coal and paper. Suppliers demand payment in the morning, and even then they hesitate. When the civil servant presents a requisition, the supplier asks a second question. Will you pay today? The state has become a customer whose promise is measured in dissolving units. The civil servant feels the embarrassment of representing an authority that can command obedience but cannot command stability. The private economy developed stabilizers of its own, crude but functional. More prices were quoted in relation to foreign currency or to goods. Some shopkeepers posted 2 columns, marks for those who insisted, and a gold price that served as the real reference. Wages in some sectors were adjusted according to indices, formal or improvised. In cafes, people spoke of dollar prices, even if they never handled a dollar. These workarounds kept transactions possible, but they also confirmed the public's verdict that the mark was no longer a trustworthy measure. A small printer in a provincial city receives an order for wedding invitations. The couple wants a simple design, nothing extravagant. The printer asks for a deposit, not to secure profit, but to secure survival. By the time he buys ink and paper, the cost will be higher. He therefore asks the couple to bring paper directly or to pay in something he can trade, such as coal coupons. The couple looks confused and offended. They wanted a ritual of stability, and instead they have entered a negotiation about replacement costs and timing. The moral atmosphere shifted as well. When prices rise rapidly, people search for agents to blame. Traders are accused of profiteering. Farmers are accused of withholding food. Bankers are accused of manipulation. Foreigners are accused of conspiracy. Some accusations touch real abuses, but many are attempts to translate a structural collapse into personal fault. Hyperinflation erodes trust not only in money, but in other people. A shopkeeper's defensive repricing looks like greed. A worker's demand for adjustment sounds like extortion. A postal clerk, asked to sell stamps, watches customers treat stamps as a store of value. They buy sheets not to write letters, but because stamped paper can be traded later. He keeps envelopes behind the counter for the same reason. When even postage becomes a commodity hedge, the message is unmistakable. The currency has failed, and society is inventing islands of stability at once. Daily life began to follow an economic schedule. Morning was for shopping before prices rose. Midday was for wage payments and immediate spending. Afternoon was for repricing and bargaining. Evening was for counting notes that would not be worth counting tomorrow. Even leisure changed. People went to cafes not only for coffee, but to exchange information about where goods could still be found. Gossip became a market signal. Anxiety became a form of literacy. Beneath the speed, another transformation was occurring. People were learning to think in different units. They converted marks into bread, into coal, into dollars, into minutes. They stopped trusting accounts kept in marks, and they began to trust inventories, relationships, and access. The economy was rebuilding itself around anything that could stand still long enough to plan, even briefly. The mark still circulated, but it no longer carried the future. Even now, the collapse had not reached its peak. The state still paid in marks, and the public still accepted them, but belief was thin enough that any further shock could tear it. In the next chapter, we will enter the most extreme phase when the numbers expand beyond comprehension. Wages are paid multiple times a day, and money becomes less a medium of exchange than a race against the clock. The peak of hyperinflation has often been remembered through images: wheelbarrows of notes, children building towers of paper, men carrying bundles like firewood. Those images are real, but they can mislead because they suggest spectacle. The deeper truth is quieter. At the peak, daily life becomes a sequence of forced choices. Do you spend now or wait? Do Do you accept payment in marks or refuse and risk losing customers? Do you hold cash for an hour or convert it at once? The mind cannot rest because the unit of account will not hold still long enough for rest. A streetcar conductor in Berlin begins his shift with a new instruction. Tickets will be repriced during the day. Passengers must pay the current fare, and the fare will be posted at major stops. He carries a small chalkboard and a cloth to wipe it. At one stop, the fare changes, and he watches a passenger fumble with a stack of notes while the car waits. The passenger is not slow. The notes are endless. Coins have vanished, and even small notes are too valuable to be convenient. The conductor accepts a handful, tears a paper ticket, and moves on, as if speed itself were the only rule that still worked. By this phase, wages were paid multiple times a day in many workplaces. The purpose was not generosity, but survival. If employees waited until evening, they would lose purchasing power between the factory gate and the shop counter. Employers therefore turned payroll into a rapid cycle: pay, spend, return, work, pay again. A foreman in a metalworks plant watches the men leave at midday with bundles of notes and return with bread wrapped in paper and sausages wrapped in string. The lunch break becomes a market sprint, and production becomes a sequence of interruptions timed to the currency's decline. Price setting became a permanent motion. Merchants stopped thinking in absolute numbers and began thinking in rates of change. A grocer does not ask, "What is the price of sugar?" He asks, "What will sugar cost me to replace this afternoon?" He prices accordingly, and customers blame him for the increase. The grocer wants to explain replacement cost, exchange rates, and supplier terms, but explanation does not bring stability. He therefore keeps his language short and his chalk handy. If he does not reprice fast enough, he will sell himself into emptiness. The state's printing presses struggled to keep denominations usable. New notes appeared in larger and larger units. Yet, even large denominations could quickly become small. The public learned to treat the design on a note as less important than the date it was printed. A newly issued note felt briefly safer, not because it held value longer, but because it could be counted with fewer pieces. Counting itself became a labor, and labor was being wasted on paper that represented less each hour. A nurse in a city hospital receives her wages and walks to buy milk for a patient who cannot eat solid food. The milk seller quotes a price and says it will change at noon. The nurse watches the clock and pays immediately. She returns to the hospital and finds that the kitchen has substituted cheaper ingredients because suppliers demanded immediate payment. The nurse realizes that the hospital, like a household, is being forced into improvised triage. Hyperinflation is not only a financial phenomenon, it reaches into care, nutrition, and the dignity of routine work. Barter expanded in the shadow of money. A factory worker offers a spare pair of boots to a butcher for meat. A clerk trades a bottle of spirits for coal. A widow trades linens for potatoes. These exchanges are not nostalgic returns to a simpler world. They are emergency substitutes for a measure that no longer measures. When barter expands, it fragments markets. It privileges those with tradable goods and disadvantages those whose only asset is wages paid in paper. Yet even in the worst phase, people still used marks, because marks were still the legal bridge between strangers. Money works when strangers agree to accept it. In 1923, strangers increasingly demanded proof that the bridge would be crossed quickly. Sellers demanded immediate payment, buyers demanded immediate delivery. The economy compressed, time horizons collapsed, long-term contracts became rare, insurance became a puzzle, pensions became tragedies. The unit of account was failing, and with it, the ability to coordinate a complex society without constant friction. This is also why the peak carried political danger. When money fails, citizens reinterpret the state. They may forgive hardship if hardship feels shared and purposeful. They are less forgiving when hardship feels like administrative drift. A police officer sent to manage a queue outside a bakery listens to complaints that are not only about bread, they are about betrayal. The officer has no tools except presence. He tells the crowd to be patient, and the crowd laughs, because patience is precisely what the currency has made impossible. By October and November, the crisis had become too visible to manage through incremental adjustments. The question was no longer whether inflation would end, but how. Ending it would require measures that could not be half believed. It would require a new anchor, and that anchor would have to be more than paper. It would have to be a credible limit on the state's ability to turn deficits into notes. In the next chapter, we will watch that search for an anchor begin. We will see how political decisions, ending passive resistance, reorganizing fiscal policy, and introducing a new unit, attempted to restore the simple thing that money needs most, a future that can be trusted. When a currency collapses, the question is never only technical. It is political, because money is a public promise and a public limit. By October 1923, Germany had reached the point where continuing the existing path was itself a decision, and a dangerous one. The Republic could no longer pretend that inflation was a temporary inconvenience. Inflation had become the mechanism of government, and the mechanism was destroying what it supported. A senior minister reads reports from the Ruhr and from the cities. Passive resistance has become unsustainable. Output is crippled, tax receipts are collapsing, and the cost of subsidies is growing faster than any decree. The minister knows that ending resistance will look like surrender, yet continuing it will look like suicide. He also knows that, behind the slogans, the public wants one thing above all, a unit of account that will not melt between payday and dinner. Political dignity matters, but a broken measure corrodes every form of dignity. A railway official in the Ruhr receives word that passive resistance will end. He does not celebrate. He feels relief mixed with fear. Relief, because the daily ambiguity of refusing orders is exhausting. Fear, because cooperation may provoke resentment and violence. He returns home and tells his family that trains may run normally again. His wife asks a simpler question: will food be affordable? In her question, politics and money touch directly. Ending passive resistance was a fiscal act as much as a diplomatic one. It signaled a willingness to stop paying people not to work. It also signaled that the government would attempt to restore revenue by restoring production. But ending resistance alone could not stabilize the mark. Stabilization required an anchor, a credible promise that deficits would no longer be financed by unlimited Reichsbank credit. Without that promise, a new note would be treated as the old note with fresh ink. Inside the Reichsbank, some officials argued that the bank had been trapped by government demands, forced to choose between social collapse and monetary collapse. Others argued that the bank had enabled fiscal drift by making financing too easy. Both views contained truth, and neither solved the immediate problem. The immediate problem was that the public no longer believed that the printing of claims would stop. To rebuild belief, the state had to demonstrate a limit. A banker in Frankfurt meets a client who wants to convert marks into dollars. The banker has seen this request for months, but now he hears a new question: will there be a new money? The client does not ask out of curiosity. He asks because he needs a stable unit for contracts. The banker answers cautiously. There are plans, he says, but plans do not matter unless the budget changes. The client nods as if he already knew. Confidence is not a mood. It is a calculation about limits. The design of a new currency for stabilization reflected this logic. The proposed Rentenmark was not a return to old gold coins in circulation. It was an attempt to create a credible measure by tying issuance to a defined base of real assets and by restricting expansion. The point was psychological and institutional, to give the public a number that would not be revised daily by necessity. The Rentenmark would be introduced alongside measures aimed at fiscal consolidation and at reducing reliance on central bank advances. A clerk in a printing house is told to prepare plates for new notes. He has printed so many different denominations that he no longer trusts paper. Yet he notices a difference in the tone of the order. The instructions emphasize limits, standardization, and careful accounting. For the first time in months, someone seems to be thinking beyond the next week. The clerk feels, in a small way, that time might slow again. Fiscal measures also mattered because stabilization requires revenue that arrives with real value. The government moved to reform tax collection and to improve administrative effectiveness. It considered emergency taxes and spending cuts that were politically painful but fiscally necessary. The goal was not elegance. The goal was a credible statement The state will live within a constraint, and the currency will be the symbol of that constraint. A shopkeeper hears rumors of a new money and responds with suspicion. She has heard rumors before. She posts prices in marks and in a gold reference. Customers ask whether she will accept the new currency. She says she will if it holds. Her condition is blunt, but it is the condition of the whole society. Money is accepted when people believe others will accept it tomorrow. The state cannot order that belief. It must earn it by proving it will not dilute the unit again. In the streets, political arguments remain fierce. Some denounce the end of resistance as betrayal. Some denounce inflation as betrayal. Some denounce both. Yet beneath the noise, a quieter shift is visible. People are exhausted. A factory worker does not want a grand theory. He wants a wage that can buy the week's food. A pensioner does not want a speech. She wants a pension that can heat her room. Exhaustion can become a political resource because it can make decisive measures possible. The path toward stabilization therefore required not only a new note, but a new sequence of commitments. End the fiscally ruinous policy of passive resistance. Create a unit with restricted issuance. Align fiscal policy so that the restriction is believable. Signal to domestic and foreign observers that the Republic intends to meet obligations through real measures rather than through the silent tax of paper. But belief returns only cautiously. In the next chapter, we will watch those commitments collide with daily reality. A new currency cannot replace habits overnight. People who have learned to run from money do not stop running simply because a new name is printed. Stabilization, if it comes when the public feels that the structure has changed and that the change will last. Stabilization in a collapsing currency is often described as a miracle, but it is better understood as an exchange. The public agrees to treat a new unit as meaningful only if the state agrees to stop treating the unit as an inexhaustible source of finance. In late 1923, Germany attempted that exchange with unusual clarity. The result was not immediate prosperity, but a slowing of time. A shopkeeper in Berlin opens her store on a cold morning and posts a new set of prices. This time, she writes them in a new unit, the Rentenmark, and she writes them carefully, as if careful writing could make them stay. Customers gather at the doorway, not in panic, but in cautious curiosity. A woman asks whether the price will still be valid after lunch. The shopkeeper hesitates, then says yes. Saying yes feels like a risk, but it is also the first step in rebuilding trust. She does not know whether she is safe. She knows only that the old speed has become intolerable. The Rentenmark's design aimed to create credibility without requiring immediate gold coins in circulation. The point was to provide a stable unit of account with restricted issuance, supported by a defined base of assets and by institutional limits. Those limits mattered more than paper quality. If the public believed that the quantity of the new currency would be controlled, the velocity that had driven hyperinflation could slow. If velocity slowed, prices could stabilize, and if prices stabilized, tax collection could regain real value, making the fiscal position less desperate. A Reichsbank clerk who has spent months issuing ever larger denominations now faces a different instruction. Restrict, account, verify. Credit is tightened. Discounting is limited. The flood of paper is slowed. The clerk feels the anxiety of denial because denial creates immediate pain, but he also feels the strange relief of constraint. A system without limits is a system without predictability. Limits, even harsh ones, make prediction possible. Again, stabilization required fiscal alignment. Ending passive resistance reduced a major drain. Production in the Ruhr could begin to recover, restoring output and revenue capacity. The government also moved to improve tax collection and to reduce the gap between assessment and receipt. In hyperinflation, delay is a form of loss. In stabilization, reducing delay is a form of rebuilding. The state had to demonstrate, not only through speeches, but through cash flow, that it could pay wages and suppliers without returning to unlimited monetary finance. A municipal treasurer reviews payroll and notices something almost forgotten. The numbers do not change between morning and afternoon. He can plan the week. He can negotiate with suppliers without apologizing for the currency. The treasurer still lacks resources. The city is not suddenly wealthy, but the work becomes intelligible again. In a functioning monetary system, intelligibility is itself an asset. A bank director explains the change to a room of clients. The Rentenmark, he says, is issued through a new institution and limited by rules. It is not to be expanded at will. He does not promise abundance. He promises restraint. Clients leave unconvinced in theory, yet calmer in practice, because the first invoices arrive with the same numbers as yesterday, and that sameness is persuasive at once. The public's behavior shifted as soon as it sensed that prices were no longer racing. When people believe a unit will hold, they stop fleeing it. They keep cash balances longer. They accept contracts with longer terms. Merchants stop repricing every hour. The same psychological mechanism that accelerates collapse can, under credible limits, accelerate stabilization. Confidence, once it returns, can be self-reinforcing because it slows velocity and makes stability easier to maintain. Yet the return of confidence was not painless. Tight credit and fiscal restraint can produce recessionary pressure. Firms that had enough relied on easy credit to cover payroll now faced harder terms. Speculators who had profited from rapid depreciation saw opportunities disappear. Debtors who had enjoyed inflation's silent relief faced a stronger unit that made obligations heavier. Stabilization creates winners and losers too, and the losers do not disappear quietly. A small manufacturer who borrowed short-term to buy inventory during inflation now faces repayment in a stable unit. His sales slow because consumers are cautious. He lays off a few workers and feels anger at the new stability because stability arrives with constraint. A worker laid off feels the same anger from the opposite direction. Hyperinflation had punished wages. Stabilization punishes weak firms. The economy is forced to reprice reality, and repricing reality is always painful. Still, the key transformation was that the unit of account regained authority. Prices could be quoted without constant revision. Wages could be negotiated without racing the clock. Savings could again be imagined, even if many were already destroyed. The state could collect taxes that retained value long enough to fund services. The bridge between today and tomorrow began to reappear. A pensioner visits the post office and receives a payment that is still modest, still disappointing, but no longer absurd. She can decide how much coal to buy and how much bread to keep. She can plan a week. Planning a week feels like a return to dignity. The loss she suffered during inflation does not vanish, but the bleeding stops. Stabilization also depended on the public's belief that the new commitment would persist. One stable week is not enough. One stable month is not enough. The memory of collapse lingers, and it makes people cautious. Shopkeepers keep an eye on the exchange rate. Workers keep an eye on prices. Banks keep an eye on government borrowing. Everyone has learned that money is not merely paper. It is shared belief made measurable, and belief can be drained again. In the next chapter, we will look beyond the immediate stabilization to the aftermath, the legal disputes over debts and contracts, the reshuffling of wealth, and the enduring scar left by a year in which money became paper. Stabilization ended the race, but it did not erase the memory of running. When the race stops, people look back and try to understand what happened to them. Stabilization in late 1923 ended the immediate collapse, but it did not end the consequences. Hyperinflation had rewritten contracts, destroyed savings, shifted wealth, and reshaped trust. After the Rentenmark arrived, Germany did not simply return to an older normal. It entered a period of reconstruction in which the arithmetic of loss had to be translated into law and memory. A landlord and tenant sit at a table with a stack of receipts. During the inflation, rent payments were made in marks that lost value between writing and payment. The landlord feels cheated. The tenant feels exhausted and insists he paid what was asked. Both are right in their own terms. The question becomes legal. What did the contract mean when the unit of account collapsed? Courts, legislators, and businesses faced thousands of such questions. Money's failure had created a fog over obligations, and clearing that fog required rules that would inevitably disappoint someone. This process was often called valorization. the attempt to adjust debts, rents, and claims to restore something like real value. But valorization is not a purely technical act. It is a decision about which promises should be revived and which should be allowed to die. Creditors wanted repayment in strengthened units. Debtors wanted recognition that they had already paid in good faith. The state had to choose rules that would not produce another crisis. Each choice created anger, because hyperinflation is a redistribution disguised as arithmetic. In a bank office, an elderly depositor brings his passbook and asks what remains. He has watched the numbers change from thousands to millions to billions, and then back to smaller units in the new money. He expects, perhaps irrationally, that the bank can translate the old figures into the new and restore what was lost. The clerk explains that the balance has been converted according to official rules and that the real value is only a fraction of what it once was. The depositor does not shout. He becomes quiet, and his quietness carries more accusation than noise. Businesses also faced a reckoning. Some firms had benefited from inflation by borrowing and repaying in depreciated money, acquiring assets along the way. Others had been destroyed because they depended on fixed contracts, long-term supplies, or savings. After stabilization, credit tightened and speculative strategies failed. Firms that had survived by speed now had to survive by efficiency and demand. For many, that was harder. Stabilization is often remembered as relief, but for some, it arrived as a new kind of pressure. A grocer who once repriced hourly now faces cautious shoppers. Without the inflationary rush, he must manage stock and margins. Stability demands discipline every day. The state, too, faced a changed relationship with the public. During hyperinflation, the state had financed itself through a silent tax on money holders. After stabilization, that method was politically toxic and economically dangerous. The public had learned what monetary financing could do. This learning created a new constraint on policy. Even when the state needed to spend, it had to consider credibility. That is one of hyperinflation's long shadows. It teaches citizens to watch money as a sign of trustworthiness. A factory worker keeps one of the old notes in a drawer, not as value, but as evidence. He shows it to his children and tells them that the number once bought almost nothing. The children laugh at the zeros, but the father does not. He has learned that work can be erased by policy and that wages can lose meaning even when they are paid. He becomes cautious. He prefers tangible goods. He prefers immediate security. The memory of inflation becomes a private lesson that shapes behavior long after prices stabilize. For pensioners and wage earners, the damage remained deep. Some lost lifetime savings. Some lost the ability to retire. Some were forced to rely on relatives. A teacher who once planned to buy a small house discovers that the dream is gone. She adjusts her ambitions downward and treats stability not as prosperity, but as a condition for survival. Such downward adjustments are not captured by national accounts, yet they shape the social atmosphere of a generation. The redistribution of wealth also had political consequences. Those seen as beneficiaries, speculators, some industrialists, those with access to foreign currency, became targets of resentment. Resentment can be directed toward real injustice, but it can also become a generalized suspicion of markets and institutions. Hyperinflation leaves behind not only poverty, but bitterness, because it violates the expectation that rules apply equally. Once that expectation breaks, rebuilding it is slow. And yet, the restoration of a stable unit did rebuild certain capacities. Contracts could again be written with meaning. Wages could again be negotiated with time for adjustment. Taxes could again fund services. Trade could resume on clearer terms. The state could again be judged on policy rather than on the daily evaporation of its currency. These are modest achievements compared to the losses, but they are the foundations of any further recovery. A bookkeeper in a mid-sized firm closes the month's accounts and feels, for the first time in years, that the figures represent something real. He can compare costs to revenue, he can plan purchases, he can discuss wages without apologizing for uncertainty. He knows the firm is not safe, the economy is still fragile. But the numbers have regained meaning, and meaning is what money is meant to provide. In the next part, we will widen the lens. We will examine why earlier attempts to control prices and wages failed, why stabilization required both fiscal and psychological changes, and how the Republic tried to rebuild belief after it had been spent. Hyperinflation ended when the structure changed, but the structure that followed had to carry the weight of memory. Before stabilization could be believed, the Republic experimented with something that always appears in inflation: commands. When money fails to hold still, governments reach for rules that force stillness. They announce price ceilings, fix exchange rates, threaten penalties, and appeal to patriotism. The intention is to halt the visible symptom, the rising number, without confronting the forces that push the number upward. In Weimar Germany, such efforts were frequent, sometimes sincere, and almost always short-lived. A butcher in a working-class district reads a notice posted on the wall of the market hall. It states that meat must not be sold above a set price. The butcher's first reaction is not rebellion, but arithmetic. His supplier's price has risen again because feed, transport, and replacement costs are rising with the mark's decline. If he sells at the ceiling, he will empty his counter and then be unable to restock. If he refuses to sell, he risks punishment and the anger of his neighbors. He cuts portions thinner, trims quality, and quietly sets aside better cuts for customers who will return later with something other than paper. In his hands, a law becomes a choice between visible defiance and invisible evasion. Price controls under inflation tend to produce the same pattern. They do not erase scarcity. They rearrange it. Sellers reduce quality, reduce quantity, or move sales into informal channels. Buyers respond by queuing earlier and hoarding more. The state responds with inspectors and penalties. Inspectors cannot inspect every kitchen and every back room. Penalties punish the visible, not the structural. The result is not stability, but a black market that becomes the true price signal. The official price becomes theater, and theater cannot feed cities. The Republic also experimented with wage controls and wage guidance, often through negotiations that tried to prevent a spiral. Employers warned that constant wage increases would destroy firms. Workers warned that without increases they would starve. Officials urged restraint, then offered subsidies to calm strikes, then issued new notes to fund those subsidies. Each intervention bought time and spent credibility. Money is a promise that requires the future. When policy trades the future for a calmer week, it teaches the public to expect more trading, more printing, more erosion. A union representative meets with factory managers in a smoky office. He carries a list of prices collected by workers' wives: bread, coal, rent, soap. He does not recite theory, he recites survival. The manager replies with his own list: import costs, replacement parts, transport charges. Both lists are true, yet the negotiation is not about truth, it is about timing. If wages are adjusted monthly, workers lose in weeks. If wages are adjusted weekly, firms lose in days. If wages are adjusted daily, money circulates faster and prices rise faster. They compromise, and the agreement feels like relief, but it also increases velocity. Exchange controls were another tool. The state tried to ration access to foreign currency, to direct scarce dollars toward essential imports, and to prevent capital flight. On paper, such controls could protect the exchange rate by reducing demand. In practice, they created a premium between official and unofficial rates. That premium became a new incentive for evasion. When an official rate is set below what people believe is real, people do not stop wanting foreign currency. They find ways to obtain it. A small importer sits in his office and fills out forms requesting dollars. He knows approval may take weeks, and weeks in 1923 were a lifetime. He also knows that competitors obtain dollars on the street at a higher price. If he waits for official approval, he may be out of stock and out of business. He therefore pays the higher price quietly, then raises his own prices, and the higher domestic price becomes evidence to customers that inflation is worsening. Controls meant to calm expectations end up confirming them. The deeper reason these commands failed is that inflation was not driven only by greed or confusion. It was driven by fiscal reality and by expectations. When the state runs a deficit and finances it through monetary expansion, the public learns that more marks will arrive. When more marks arrive, sellers protect themselves by repricing, and buyers protect themselves by spending faster. A command can punish repricing, but it cannot supply goods or eliminate deficits. It can delay, distort, and conceal, but it cannot restore trust. By the time the crisis peaked, many Germans had learned to distinguish between a change in rules and a change in structure. A new notice on a wall was a rule. A credible end to monetary financing was a structure. The public did not demand perfection. It demanded a believable limit. Until that limit appeared, price ceilings, wage guidance, and exchange rationing were seen as a temporary theater. In one city, officials announced fair bread prices and sent inspectors to enforce them. Bakers complied outwardly, then adjusted inwardly. Smaller loaves, cheaper flour, less time in the oven. Customers felt cheated, yet replacement costs kept rising, and selling at the ceiling meant selling into emptiness. In the evenings, trade slipped into back doors and private favors, where the true price could be paid without the glare of law. The same logic applied to fixed exchange proclamations. An official number created an unofficial number, and the gap became an incentive. Posters condemned speculators, but the public was reacting to experience. More marks arrived, and each arrival weakened the unit. Controls could punish symptoms, delay adjustments, and deepen suspicion. They could not supply goods or close deficits. Without a credible constraint, every command looked temporary. And so the city learned enforcement cannot manufacture trust overnight, alone. In the next chapter, we will examine another attempted fix: the improvised indexing of contracts and the desperate effort to make old obligations meaningful in a unit that would not behave. When the unit of account fails, society does not simply stop making agreements. It invents new ways to measure them. In Weimar Germany, one of the most revealing adaptations was the turn toward indexing, sometimes formal, often improvised. People linked rents, wages, and invoices to foreign currency, to gold, or to baskets of goods. They did this not because they loved complexity, but because they needed a ruler that would not shrink while they were using it. A landlord in a Berlin apartment block meets a tenant in the stairwell with a proposal. Rent, he says, will be tied to the gold mark value listed in the newspaper. The tenant protests that his wages are paid in paper. The landlord replies that his own mortgage and repairs are becoming impossible. Neither man is dishonest. The argument is about which side will absorb the loss created by the failing unit. In stable times, contracts allocate risk quietly. In hyperinflation, risk becomes the contract's main subject. Indexing can slow conflict by making payments adjust automatically, yet it also spreads awareness that the official unit is no longer trusted. When rent is quoted in gold, the tenant begins to think in gold. When wages are adjusted by an index, workers begin to watch the index like weather. When merchants quote prices in dollars, customers internalize the dollar as the true measure. The more society shifts into alternative measures, the less the old measure can recover, because recovery depends on coordination around a single standard. A bakery owner prints small flyers listing daily equivalent prices in foreign currency for regular customers. He does not accept dollars, he accepts marks, but the marks must match the day's equivalent. Customers bring more marks each day and tell each other grimly that the bread is really worth a fraction of a dollar. The owner has created a private anchor. It keeps his business coherent. It also tells the neighborhood that the national anchor is gone. The state itself flirted with index-like measures. Officials discussed adjusting taxes and fees to reduce the destructive effect of collection lag. Some municipalities tried to collect in kind where possible or to demand prepayment. Yet these measures were uneven and often met with resistance because they felt arbitrary. A tax collector who demands payment immediately appears brutal, even if he is trying to prevent the city's budget from dissolving. In a collapsing unit, even rational administrative behavior can look like abuse. A postal supervisor receives instructions to reprice stamps repeatedly. She watches clerks change posters behind the counter and sees customers buy sheets at once, not to mail letters, but to store value. The supervisor understands the logic. A stamp for a few days is a claim on a service, and services can hold value better than cash. She begins to accept that her post office has become a kind of marketplace for hedges. When public services turn into stores of value, money has already failed in practice. Indexing also reshaped wage bargaining. Some firms began to adjust wages according to published cost of living indices, sometimes with short lags. The intention was fairness, the effect was mixed. If adjustments lag, workers still lose. If adjustments are immediate, velocity rises, because workers receive money that must be spent instantly. In the peak, even indexed wages could not keep pace, because indices were compiled with delay, and delay meant loss. A bookkeeper in a textile firm tries to maintain payroll using an index that arrives weekly. He calculates adjustments, prints pay slips, and watches workers complain that the new wage was already obsolete by the morning's prices. The bookkeeper is not lying. He is using the best tool available, yet the tool is still built on an assumption of slower time. Hyperinflation breaks not only money, but the informational systems that money supports. These adaptations reveal a crucial point. Stabilization could not be achieved by asking everyone to behave better within a broken unit. It required providing a unit that would restore coordination across society. Indexing is a bridge, but it is also an admission that the river has flooded the old road. People build bridges when they do not expect the water to recede soon. By the autumn of 1923, the economy had already admitted the truth in practice. A stable measure was needed, and society would cling to any measure that seemed to stand still. That is why, when the Rentenmark arrived, its earliest success depended on appearing not as another bridge of improvisation, but as the restoration of a single shared ruler. Courts and notaries became unwilling economists. A small firm brought an invoice. Dispute to court, arguing that late payment in marks destroyed real value. The buyer replied that the contract demanded marks, and he paid marks. Any ruling seemed unjust. Favor the seller and you rewrite contracts after the fact. Favor the buyer and you reward delay. The law could not fully repair what the unit had broken. Industries built their own indexing conventions. Some wages followed cost of living tables with shorter lags. Some rents followed goldmark references. Some invoices followed daily dollar equivalents. These bridges reduced open conflict and kept trade possible, but they also taught everyone the same lesson. The national measure was no longer trusted. In workshops, change occurred. Foremen wrote wage promises in goods terms on pay slips, how many loaves or kilos of coal the wage should represent. It was reassurance, an admission that marks alone no longer spoke. A pension office posted an index, and retirees arrived with calculators, trying to translate dignity into numbers before the numbers drifted again. In the next chapter, we will return to the state's fiscal heart, because no measure can be trusted if the state that issues it must still pay more than it can collect. The simplest definition of a stable currency is a promise with a limit. In Weimar Germany, the crisis persisted because the public could not see a limit. The state's spending was visible: wages, subsidies, support for passive resistance, and emergency measures. The state's revenue was less visible, and in real terms it was collapsing. The gap between them was filled by Reichsbank credit. This was the structural engine of depreciation, and any lasting solution had to begin at the fiscal core. A treasury clerk sits late in a dim office surrounded by requests. The railway demands fuel. The civil service demands wages. Municipalities demand transfers to keep water and sanitation operating. The clerk totals the requests and compares them to expected receipts. The receipts are marks and the marks are shrinking. He feels as if he is counting snowflakes for warmth. His supervisor tells him that the state cannot allow payments to fail because failure would mean disorder. The clerk believes him, yet he also sees that the method of preventing immediate disorder is creating a different disorder, one that spreads through every price tag and payslip. The tax system was not designed for accelerated depreciation. Even when rates were raised, assessment and collection took time. Businesses and households learned to delay payments because delay reduced real burden. Some did so opportunistically, many did so simply because cash flows were chaotic. The result was that the state collected nominally large sums that bought little. This made deficits appear permanent, and permanence made the public expect continuing money creation. Expectations then raised velocity, and higher velocity made prices rise faster, and faster rising prices made collection lags even more destructive. A small factory owner receives a tax bill that seems enormous. He waits a week, not out of defiance, but because he needs to sell inventory first. When he pays, the bill is still paid in full in nominal terms, and the tax office records compliance. Yet the real value collected has eroded. The owner feels relief. The state feels loss. In this way, inflation turns ordinary timing into redistribution, and redistribution into a hidden weakening of the state's capacity to provide services. In late 1923, key officials recognized that the only path forward required fiscal consolidation. This meant ending the most expensive policies, especially passive resistance, and reasserting the capacity to collect real revenue. It also meant restricting central bank financing by creating institutional barriers. Without barriers, any new currency would be treated as a temporary label for the same old habit. A municipal administrator receives a directive to collect certain fees in advance. Residents protest, arguing that prepayment is unfair. The administrator explains that without prepayment, the city cannot buy coal for the school. Some residents pay, some refuse, and tensions rise. Fiscal reform is rarely gentle, yet it is the price of a currency that holds. A stable unit requires a state that can meet obligations without constantly diluting the unit. Reform also meant reorganizing the calendar of money. Ministries tried to shorten payment chains so suppliers could be paid without weeks of delay, which only pushed prices higher. Some agencies demanded prepayment for services. Municipal councils debated collecting fees weekly rather than quarterly. These arguments sounded petty, yet they were central. A fee collected slowly in a collapsing unit could not fund streetlights or school coal. At a town hall meeting, a mayor compared nominal taxes collected with the coal they could actually buy. The room went quiet. Citizens saw that payment on paper did not keep the city running. Faster collection and spending restraint became the foundation of any credible new money. Fiscal consolidation meant refusing requests even when refusal was unpopular. A finance official put it plainly: if every problem is solved by issuing claims, the claims stop solving anything. In one district, coal for schools was purchased only after parents prepaid small levies. The indignity was sharp, yet the classroom stayed warm today, and the new currency's promise felt less abstract. By accepting the necessity of a binding constraint, the Republic began to reverse the expectation that money would always be used as a substitute for political decision. Constraint does not create prosperity by itself. It creates the possibility of calculation, and calculation is the foundation of recovery. In the next chapter, we will look at the Rentenmark's introduction as a choreography of credibility. We will see how institutional design, messaging, and the visible end of certain practices combined to persuade citizens that time could slow again. A currency reform succeeds when it changes expectations faster than reality can undermine it. The Rentenmark's introduction in late 1923 was therefore less like a technical swap and more like a carefully staged demonstration of limits. The public had learned to distrust declarations. It needed to see a structure that could resist temptation. A bank clerk in Stuttgart receives the first Rentenmark notes and handles them with a caution that borders on superstition. They look ordinary, yet their promise is extraordinary, that this unit will not melt between morning and evening. Customers arrive with questions that are not polite. How many are there? Who decides? Can they print more? The clerk answers using the new language of constraint. Issuance is limited, backed by claims on real assets and governed by rules. Some customers leave unconvinced, others leave quieter, testing the promise not with belief, but with tomorrow's grocery list. The Rentenmark was not simply declared valuable by law, it was tied to an institutional narrative, that it was anchored by a mortgage-like claim on German land and industrial property through a new institution, and that it would be issued in fixed relation to that base. Whether every citizen understood the details mattered less than whether citizens understood the implication. Expansion would be controlled. In a world where the mark had expanded without apparent limit, the word limit itself was powerful. Just as important was the visible shift in central bank behavior. Credit conditions tightened, discounting of certain paper was restricted, the flow of ever larger denominations slowed. These actions signaled that the old practice of financing the budget by issuing claims was being curtailed. A new unit without a new practice would have failed, because the public would have seen through it. The public judges money by the behavior of those who issue it, not by the elegance of its design. The conversion itself was presented as an act of clarity. Officials set a simple relation between the new unit and a stable reference so that prices and accounts could be translated without endless bargaining. Banks posted tables. Newspapers printed explanations in plain language. Most citizens did not need institutional detail. They needed to know what a Rentenmark would buy and whether it would buy the same tomorrow. The reform relied on repetition, the same message, the same numbers, day after day. A newspaper editor who had spent months printing exchange rates like obituaries now printed a small daily box, Rentenmark stable. He chose restrained language, no triumph, no certainty, only the quiet reporting of sameness. Readers tested that sameness in markets and on paydays. Some skepticism remained. Merchants accepted Rentenmarks but kept foreign equivalents in a ledger as insurance. Workers spent their first wages quickly out of habit, then noticed prices had not moved by evening and allowed themselves to keep a note overnight. These tiny experiments accumulated into confidence. Behind the public messaging stood institutional separation. The Rentenmark was issued through an apparatus meant to insulate it from day-to-day treasury need, and its quantity was restricted so citizens could imagine an end to expansion. The new unit was accepted for taxes and fees, pulling public payments into the same standard. When people could pay and be paid in a unit that held, the standard began to spread. For many, that was enough. Banks were instructed to treat the new unit as the default for settlement, and the old habits of automatic advances were publicly curtailed. Each refusal to inflate became a performance of restraint that markets could see. A payroll manager in a factory spends a long night recalculating wages. He converts old figures into the new unit and prints pay slips. Workers gather at the gate the next day, anxious. The manager hands out wages in the new money and watches the workers go to shops. The shops accept the notes. Prices are stable. When the workers return, they have bought what they planned. The manager feels something rare. A day completed without a race. This is how confidence returns, not through speeches, but through repeated ordinary successes. Each day that the new unit holds, the public holds it longer. Each time the public holds it longer, velocity slows. Each time velocity slows, prices stabilize. Stabilization is therefore a feedback loop too, but in the opposite direction. It replaces the spiral of fear with a spiral of calm, provided the state does not break the constraint. In the next chapter, we will examine the immediate economic consequences of stabilization, the credit squeeze, the failures, the resentments, and the necessary reordering. A stable unit restores measurement, but measurement reveals weakness. Once the currency stops moving, the economy must face what inflation had concealed. Stabilization is often celebrated as rescue, but it is also an unveiling. Inflation hides inefficiency by lifting nominal figures and by allowing debts to be repaid in cheaper money. When stabilization arrives, the veil is removed, credit tightens, speculative strategies fail, weak firms collapse, unemployment can rise. The same society that demanded stability may resent the discipline that stability requires. In a labor exchange office, an unemployed metal worker waited for postings. During hyperinflation, he feared that wages would vanish before he could spend them. Now, he feared there would be no wages at all. Stabilization ended the monetary panic, but it exposed real disruptions that inflation had disguised. He listened to talk of reorganization and walked home calculating how long his household could last. Banks became more conservative. Depositors expected value to be preserved, and banks tightened standards, preferring short maturities and sound collateral. This supported stability but limited expansion. A shopkeeper seeking credit to rebuild inventory found terms harsh and borrowed less, growing slowly. A small manufacturer who had relied on inflationary turnover saw orders fall and credit tighten. He dismissed a few workers, then closed one workshop, then sold equipment at a loss. Stability felt like judgment, yet the remaining firms could now invest with clearer prices and predictable accounts. Households gradually relearned longer horizons. A clerk who once spent wages within an hour began keeping a portion for the week, then for the month, testing the idea of saving as if it were a new craft. Saving returned, slowly and cautiously. The black market faded as official prices regained credibility, though barter persisted in places from habit and distrust. The central fact remained: stabilization did not undo redistribution, it only stopped it, without a stable measure. Questions of fairness and compensation could not even be stated clearly. Restoring the language of money made recovery possible, but it did not make it painless. In the next part, we will turn to the long shadow: how memory of hyperinflation shaped behavior, politics, and the demand for constraints. The year when money became paper did not end when the paper was replaced. It ended when society rebuilt belief, and belief, once broken, returns slowly. Even after the currency stabilized, the memory of instability remained active, like a wound that is closed but still aches in cold weather. Hyperinflation teaches a population to watch the unit of account the way sailors watch the sky. It trains citizens to treat money not as a neutral tool, but as a sign of whether the state deserves trust. This learned vigilance became one of Weimar's most enduring legacies. A retired civil servant keeps a small envelope of old notes in a drawer. He cannot use them. He does not need them, yet he cannot throw them away. They serve as proof that the world he lived in, where salaries and pensions promised security, can be undone by the slow arithmetic of depreciation. When he hears politicians speak of budgets and programs, he listens differently. He asks not only what they promise, but how they will pay. His suspicion is not cynical, it is protective. He has seen what happens when promises are funded by paper. Households that lost savings did not easily return to the practice of saving and financial claims. Some shifted toward tangible assets, tools, durable goods, property when possible. Others sought foreign currency when allowed. Many simply stopped imagining that small accumulations could be defended over time. This shift matters because saving is not only a private virtue, it is a social resource. When trust in financial saving erodes, investment patterns change, and the relationship between citizens and institutions becomes harder to stabilize. A young couple in a city considers opening a savings account. The husband's father warns against it. He tells them that numbers can be erased. The couple chooses to buy furniture first and keep little cash. This is rational given their inherited fear, yet it also reduces the pool of stable domestic savings that banks rely on. Hyperinflation therefore reshapes the future, not only through lost wealth, but through changed behavior. Firms, too, carried memory. Accounting departments began to treat currency stability as a strategic variable. Contracts included clauses about adjustment and payment terms. Businesses preferred shorter maturities and insisted on clearer collateral. These changes can be framed as prudence, But they also reveal that trust was not fully restored. Trust does not return as a single act. It returns through repeated confirmations, and it is always conditional. A bank director meets with industrial clients and hears questions that would have sounded odd before 1914. What is the government's deficit? Will the central bank be pressured? What limits exist? In stable periods, such questions are relegated to specialists. After hyperinflation, they became practical. A society that has experienced monetary collapse becomes a society that monitors the institutions that manage money. This vigilance can be stabilizing. It can also be politically constraining. When citizens fear inflation, they may oppose fiscal measures even when those measures are socially valuable. They may prefer austerity to risk. They may treat any expansion as the first step toward collapse. The trauma of inflation can become a permanent demand for restraint. Whether that restraint is always economically optimal is a different question. The key point is that memory changes the range of policies that feel legitimate. A schoolteacher who lost her savings becomes intensely risk-averse. She refuses loans. She keeps household spending tight. She encourages her children to choose stable professions. These private choices, multiplied across a generation, shape the economy's appetite for risk and the politics' appetite for expansion. Hyperinflation becomes a silent influence on the future, even when prices are stable. Internationally, stabilization improved Germany's ability to trade and negotiate because partners could again calculate. A stable unit makes commerce possible without constant hedging. It also makes debt obligations and reparations negotiations more intelligible. Yet the political scars remained, for many Germans felt that external pressure had contributed to the crisis. Many abroad felt that Germany's choices had contributed. Money, which should be a neutral measure, became a symbol of contested justice. Symbols linger longer than numbers. In this way, the Rentenmark and the subsequent monetary arrangements did more than stop a crisis. They defined a new political baseline. Money must be protected, and protection must be institutional. The lesson was not that money should never be expanded. It was that expansion without a credible limit destroys belief, and belief is the substance of monetary order. In the next chapter, we will return to the question of reparations and external obligations, not to rehearse moral arguments, but to show how external constraints interact with domestic fiscal weakness. Hyperinflation emerged from a structure, and the structure included both internal politics and external demands. Hyperinflation is often told as an internal story. A government prints, prices rise, money dies. But Weimar Germany's crisis unfolded at the intersection of domestic weakness and external constraint. Reparations mattered not simply as a burden, but as a channel through which Germany's fiscal and political problems became visible in the exchange rate. External obligations forced the Republic to confront the difference between paper promises and real transfers. A finance official studies a table of payments required in foreign currency or in gold-equivalent terms. He knows that marks cannot be printed into dollars. To pay abroad, Germany must earn foreign currency through exports, attract foreign loans, or transfer real goods. Each option is politically charged. Export surpluses require wage restraint and productivity. Foreign loans require confidence in German stability. Transfers of goods can provoke domestic resentment and shortages. Each path demands coordination and patience. And patience is precisely what inflation destroys. In 1921 and 1922, uncertainty about reparations undermined confidence and weakened the mark. A weaker mark increased import costs, raised domestic prices, and worsened fiscal strain. In 1923, the Ruhr occupation turned this interaction into a crisis. The occupation reduced production and revenue while increasing political pressure and government spending. The state responded with passive resistance financed through monetary expansion. The exchange rate fell further, prices rose faster, and the spiral tightened. External enforcement, domestic defiance, and monetary financing became one intertwined mechanism. A steel worker in the Ruhr hears politicians speak of national honor and foreign injustice. He agrees with the sentiment. Yet, at home, his wife is trading linens for potatoes. The steelworker's life shows the collision. a geopolitical dispute expressed as a domestic collapse of purchasing power. He can be right about injustice and still be hungry. Hyperinflation does not ask whether grievances are justified. It amplifies every grievance by dissolving the measure that allows ordinary life to function. After stabilization, reparations remained a central issue, but the nature of the issue shifted. With a stable unit, Germany could negotiate from a position of clearer calculation, and foreign observers could evaluate capacity more credibly. Stability did not remove the burden, but it made the burden measurable. Measurement is not comfort, yet it is a prerequisite for settlement. In the years that followed, new arrangements and external loans contributed to temporary relief and reconstruction. The key point for our purpose is that the currency's collapse had made negotiation harder because it made Germany appear ungovernable and made foreign actors more willing to enforce. A banker in Berlin meets a foreign representative and hears a straightforward statement: stability is a condition for credit. The banker nods because he has learned the same lesson internally. Money and sovereignty are linked through confidence. When confidence collapses, both domestic and foreign relationships become harder to sustain. This interplay between external demand and internal policy also shows why hyperinflation cannot be reduced to a single villain. External pressure did not force Germany to finance deficits through unlimited money creation. Domestic choices and constraints did that. Domestic politics did not invent foreign obligations. External treaties and enforcement did that. The crisis emerged because the structure offered few acceptable options, and because each attempted option, defiance, delay, negotiation, compromise, carried a fiscal cost that the state funded through paper. A customs officer at a border post watches smugglers move goods across lines. They do so because goods hold value better than money. Smuggling reduces tax revenue and increases scarcity. Scarcity raises prices higher. Prices raise wage demands. Wage demands increase fiscal pressure. The officer sees only the small transaction, but the small transaction is part of the same structure. When money fails, shadow trade grows, and shadow trade weakens the state that might restore money. The lesson is not that external obligations always cause inflation. The lesson is that external obligations magnify internal weakness by making it visible and by forcing real transfers that paper cannot accomplish. If a state is fiscally strong and politically stable, it can meet external obligations without destroying its currency. If it is fiscally weak and politically divided, external obligations can become a catalyst that turns chronic inflation into collapse. In the next chapter, we will crystallize the core mechanism, why printing is never the whole story, and why expectations and velocity transform policy choices into runaway outcomes. We will return to the idea that money is shared belief made measurable, and we will examine how belief can be drained and rebuilt through institutional limits. By the time Weimar's hyperinflation ended, many observers wanted a simple explanation. Simplicity is comforting. It allows blame and closure. They printed too much is such an explanation. It is not entirely wrong, but it is incomplete. Printing is the visible act. Hyperinflation is the structural outcome when printing becomes the bridge between promises and resources, and when the public stops believing that the bridge has an end. A printer at the Reichsdruckerei once joked that his machines were saving the Republic by working through the night. In 1923, the joke turned sour. He realized the machines were not saving the Republic. They were translating the Republic's inability to settle its fiscal conflicts into paper. The machines did not create the conflict, they amplified it, because they made postponement possible. Postponement, when repeated, becomes a habit, and habit becomes an expectation. Expectations are the reason printing is not enough. If a state prints more money while the public believes the expansion is temporary, people may hold the money and spend it gradually. Prices rise, but not explosively. If a state prints more money while the public believes expansion will continue, people spend faster to avoid loss. That faster spending increases velocity. Velocity turns a large money stock into a furious one, and the fury is what we recognize as hyperinflation. The same note buys less, not only because there are more notes, but because everyone is trying to get rid of them before they shrink again. A shopkeeper who reprices hourly is not responding to a statistic. She is responding to replacement cost and to the belief that tomorrow's marks will buy less inventory. When she reprices, she signals to customers that inflation is accelerating. Customers then spend faster. The shopkeeper sees them spend faster and reprices again. The loop is social, as much as monetary. Hyperinflation is the moment when society collectively shifts from treating money as an asset to treating it as a liability. Fiscal structure lies beneath this social loop. The state's deficit in real terms could not be covered by taxes collected in a unit that was collapsing, and borrowing depended on confidence that was disappearing. The state therefore used central bank financing. Each time it did so, it validated the public's expectation of continued expansion. Validation accelerates velocity. Higher velocity raises prices faster. Faster prices erode real tax revenue further. The deficit widens. Monetary financing increases. The loop tightens. This is why the crisis is a structure. A tax official who sends bills with a month's delay is not malicious. He's operating a machine built for stable time. Under hyperinflation, stable time is gone. His delay becomes a subsidy to debtors and a disaster for the state. Administrative lag becomes an economic force. In this way, hyperinflation is not only a failure of monetary policy, it is a failure of institutional timing under extreme conditions. The stabilization therefore worked because it attacked expectations and structure at once. Ending passive resistance reduced the fiscal hemorrhage. Restricting monetary financing demonstrated a limit. Introducing a new unit with constrained issuance changed the public's forecast. Once people believed the unit could hold, they stopped fleeing it. Velocity slowed, prices stabilized, revenue regained meaning. The same feedback loop that had accelerated collapse now accelerated calm. A factory worker who once spent wages within minutes kept a Rentenmark note overnight and discovered it still bought the same bread the next morning. This small experience was more persuasive than any speech. It was proof that time could be bridged again. That is what money does. It lets today speak to tomorrow without shouting. The Weimar story therefore teaches a general lesson. Money is not simply a quantity. It is a contract between the state and the public. The public accepts money because it expects others to accept it, and because it expects the issuer not to dilute it beyond recognition. The issuer maintains money by demonstrating fiscal capacity and restraint. When restraint is not credible, money becomes a hot coal. When restraint becomes credible, money becomes a quiet tool again. Another lesson is about hidden taxes. Inflation can fund a state by reducing the real value of its obligations and by transferring resources from money holders to the issuer. This can feel politically easier than explicit taxation because it is harder to trace. But ease is deceptive. The political cost arrives later in the form of destroyed trust. When the public learns that money can be used as a tax without a vote, it becomes skeptical of all promises. A pensioner who lost her savings does not care whether economists argue about causality. She cares that her prudence was punished. Her experience becomes part of the culture. Culture is not measured in indices, but it shapes what policies are possible. A society that has experienced hyperinflation becomes a society that demands limits, sometimes even at the cost of flexibility. In the next chapter, we will step back and reflect on what hyperinflation does to an empire-like state in miniature, how it changes social relationships, political legitimacy, and the meaning of obligation. The crisis was about money, but the damage reached beyond money, because money is the language of coordination, and when language fails, society must speak in harsher ways. Hyperinflation is often described in terms of economics, but its deepest effects are social. Money is the quiet infrastructure of trust. It allows strangers to cooperate, workers to plan, families to budget, and institutions to function without constant negotiation. When that infrastructure fails, society does not stop functioning, but it functions with more friction, more suspicion, and more improvisation. The costs are not only financial, they are relational. A baker in a city neighborhood remembers how customers once bought bread with casual conversation. During the peak, conversation became bargaining. Customers accused him of raising prices unfairly. He accused suppliers. Suppliers accused the exchange rate. Everyone felt cornered. The baker did not become greedy overnight. He became defensive. Defense became the dominant social posture. When money fails, people interpret each other's actions through fear. This friction shows up in the smallest exchanges. A worker pays a landlord in marks that will lose value overnight. The landlord demands adjustment. The worker feels exploited. The landlord feels cheated. The conflict is not about character. It is about the collapsing unit. Hyperinflation turns ordinary contracts into contests because it changes who bears risk. In stable money, risk is hidden. In unstable money, risk is visible and fought over. Families also experienced a reordering of roles. Children were sent to markets because they could run quickly. Wives and husbands divided shopping tasks as if the household were an emergency committee. Elderly relatives who once relied on pensions became dependent. Young people who could navigate trade and timing gained influence. These shifts can create resilience, but they also create strain, because they force households to become survival organizations. A grandmother who once offered advice about prudence now asks her daughter for coal. The daughter offers it, but the exchange carries pain, because the older generation's life plan has been invalidated. Hyperinflation breaks the moral promise that careful behavior is rewarded. When that promise breaks, respect for institutions erodes. People begin to ask whether laws and contracts mean anything if money can erase them. Political legitimacy suffers in this environment because the state is judged not only by its laws but by its ability to maintain the measure through which laws are experienced. A state may pass welfare rules, wage rules, rent rules, and tax rules. If the currency collapses, all these rules become unstable in practice. Citizens stop believing that the state can protect them, even if officials intend protection. Intention cannot substitute for measure. This is why hyperinflation often generates scapegoats and conspiracy thinking. A complex structural failure is hard to grasp. People therefore personalize it. They blame merchants, bankers, foreigners, and political enemies. Some blame is deserved when profiteering and corruption occur, and they often do. But scapegoating also becomes a substitute for structural understanding. It offers emotional clarity without policy clarity. It can destroy social cohesion at the moment cohesion is most needed. A policeman tasked with managing a queue outside a bread shop listens to arguments that begin with food and end with politics. One customer claims the shopkeeper is hiding flour. Another claims the government is lying about supplies. Another claims foreign powers are engineering collapse. The policeman cannot answer these claims. He can only keep order. This is how institutional legitimacy erodes. The state is reduced to managing symptoms while citizens lose faith in the underlying system. Yet, hyperinflation also reveals what people will do to sustain life. They organize informal credit among neighbors. They trade goods and services. They create local currencies. They share information about where food is available. These adaptations show that society does not collapse easily. It reshapes itself. The tragedy is that reshaping comes at the cost of long-term planning and at the cost of trust in impersonal systems. A modern economy depends on impersonal trust, trust that contracts will be honored and that money will hold. Hyperinflation pushes people back toward personal networks and immediate exchange. After stabilization, these networks do not vanish. People keep habits of caution. They prefer tangible assets. They distrust long-term promises. This can be prudent, but it can also reduce the willingness to invest in collective institutions. A society that has been betrayed by its unit of account becomes a society that demands stronger safeguards. Safeguards are necessary, but they also constrain. The shadow of hyperinflation therefore reaches into politics and into everyday life long after the numbers stabilize. A small business owner who survived the peak by trading goods rather than relying on money continues to keep inventory high even when stability returns. He sees inventory as security. This reduces efficiency, but it increases his sense of safety. In aggregate, such choices reshape the economy. Trauma becomes an economic variable. The Weimar episode is therefore not only a cautionary tale about money creation, it is a tale about institutions, trust, and the fragile language through which a society measures what it owes to itself. When that language fails, the society must speak in other languages: barter, favors, suspicion, force, and those languages are harsher. In the final chapter, we will close calmly and reflectively. We will not search for easy morals. We will return to the core. Money is shared belief made measurable, and preserving that belief is not a matter of paper design, but of credible limits, honest accounting, and institutions that can endure pressure without turning the future into ink. The Weimar hyperinflation is often remembered as a spectacle of zeros, but its true meaning is quieter. It is the story of a society trying to live when the measure of living stops holding still. It is the story of how time becomes unreliable and how that unreliability spreads from markets into kitchens, schools, hospitals, and courts. It is also the story of how stability returns, not by magic, but by rebuilding the conditions of belief. In Berlin, long after the crisis, a former clerk remembers the satchel of notes and the way his hands learned speed. He remembers the feeling of being paid and immediately becoming poorer if he waited. He remembers the chalkboard prices and the sudden changes while people stood in line. What he remembers most is not the numbers, but the sensation that the world's agreements had become slippery. Hyperinflation turns the ordinary into a negotiation, and negotiation into exhaustion. A widow remembers her tin box of savings. She remembers the day she opened it and realized the paper inside could not buy warmth. She did not lose only money. She lost a rule she had trusted, that careful behavior accumulates protection. When that rule breaks, the injury is moral as much as financial. It is an injury to the idea that society honors prudence. A shopkeeper remembers the accusations of greed. She remembers trying to explain replacement cost and being met with anger. She remembers hiding small stores of goods not to exploit neighbors, but to ensure she could restock. She remembers that every defensive act looked like a moral failure to someone else. Hyperinflation makes decent behavior difficult because it changes incentives and then judges people for responding to them. The structural mechanism, once seen, is not mysterious. Germany financed a war largely through borrowing and monetary support. After defeat, it inherited debt, weakened confidence, and political instability. Reparations and external pressures sharpened those vulnerabilities. The Ruhr occupation and passive resistance created an emergency deficit financed through monetary expansion. The public, learning from experience, accelerated spending to avoid loss. Velocity rose, prices rose faster, tax collection lag destroyed real revenue. Deficits widened, monetary financing continued, the loop tightened until belief drained almost entirely. The point is not to say that all hyperinflations are identical, but to recognize the pattern that makes them possible. A state promises more than it can fund through taxes and credible borrowing. It uses money creation to bridge the gap. The public learns to expect continued creation. Expectation changes behavior. Behavior accelerates the loss of money's meaning. The unit of account stops coordinating. Society begins improvising alternative measures. The state loses not only monetary stability, but a portion of its legitimacy, because legitimacy depends on keeping the shared measure intact. Stabilization worked because the structure changed. Passive resistance ended. Fiscal policy moved toward constraint. A new unit was introduced with limited issuance. Central bank behavior shifted visibly. The public tested the new unit in daily transactions and found that it held. That holding slowed velocity. Slower velocity stabilized prices. Stabilized prices restored the possibility of planning. Planning restored the possibility of ordinary trust. This is the final lesson. Money is not paper. Money is shared belief made measurable. It is a bridge between today and tomorrow. The bridge holds when institutions demonstrate limits and when the public expects those limits to endure. The bridge fails when the issuer must keep adding planks of paper to cover a deficit of real resources and cannot credibly stop. The Weimar experience also teaches that the cost of using inflation as a substitute for decision is paid later. in trust. A government can postpone explicit taxation or explicit austerity by issuing claims. For a time, this postponement can feel like relief, but relief bought by undermining the unit of account is relief bought by undermining coordination itself. Eventually, the bill arrives not as a single payment, but as a collapse of measurement. And when measurement collapses, society pays in time, dignity, and suspicion. A man who lived through 1923 would later tell his children that the worst part was not poverty, but the constant calculation. It was the inability to rest because numbers were always moving. In a stable monetary system, people can direct attention toward craft, family, and future plans. In hyperinflation, attention is consumed by defense. The economy becomes a battlefield of timing, and the human spirit becomes tired. If there is a hopeful note, it is that belief can be rebuilt, but not by slogans. It is rebuilt through structures that make restraint credible, and through repeated ordinary experiences that confirm the structure. A stable currency is not a gift. It is a disciplined agreement maintained by institutions and by public expectation. When that agreement is broken, rebuilding it takes time, and time is precisely what collapse destroys. So we end where we began. Money looks like paper, but it is more than paper. It is a social contract, a shared grammar of exchange, and a promise that the future will not be rewritten by the multiplication of claims. Weimar Germany shows what happens when that grammar breaks. It also shows what is required to restore it, limits that can be believed, and belief that can be lived.